There is a hill above a slow brown river, and on that hill there is a hut, and in the doorway of that hut there is a single small oil lamp, burning. It is evening, and the light is very old and very soft. The lamp is a little clay thing, no larger than a closed hand, and its one flame leans and steadies, in the warm air coming up off the water. Around it the hill is green and quiet. There are sheep somewhere lower down, their bells hushed by distance, and the smell of wood smoke, and the smell of the river, which is the smell of mud and reeds, and something faintly green. The person who lit that lamp has gone inside to sleep, and the flame is left to keep its own small watch over the doorway, over the hill. Over the 7 low hills that stand together here in a loose ring above the marshy plain. Nobody on that hill knows anything at all about what is coming. They do not know that from this small place, from these few huts and this handful of shepherds and this one patient river, a story will grow that will reach across the whole of the known world and last for 1,000 years, and go on echoing in the roads and the words and the very calendars of people who will not be born for 2,000 more. They only know that it is evening, and that the lamp is lit, and that it is time to rest. And that, tonight, is exactly where we are going to begin. So let us begin the way the evening begins, slowly, and with nowhere at all we need to be. Settle in, make yourself as comfortable and as heavy as you can. If you are lying down, let the whole weight of you be held by whatever is holding you, and let it take that weight completely, because it can, and it will. Let the lamp in your own room grow dim. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been hiding all day, and let us take 3 slow breaths together, in no hurry, the way the flame leans and steadies. Breathe in gently, and let the night come a little closer. And let it go, soft and long. Again breathe in, and feel the quiet gather at the edges of the room. And let it go, and once more the slowest one drawing in the whole calm of the evening, and letting it drift out, and away, and down. Good. That is all you ever have to do here. Now before we walk down into the story, a few small and gentle housekeeping things, and then I promise I will not interrupt the night again. If you enjoy these long quiet histories, if this is a voice you would like to have waiting for you on other sleepless nights, you are very welcome to follow along, to leave a like, to subscribe, but only, and I mean this, only if you truly enjoy what I do here. This is a place for rest, not for obligation, and a lamp does not ask anything of the moth. And if you would like to feel a little less alone in the dark tonight, you might leave, somewhere in the comments, your location and your local time as you listen, just a town and an hour, nothing more, so that all of us drifting off can picture the whole map of it, all the sleepless little lamps burning quietly together across the turning world, one in a city that is deep in winter, one where it is nearly dawn, one out where the nearest neighbour is a field away, all of us settling down at the same unhurried pace. There, that is done, and we need not think of it again. Now let the map in your mind go soft, and let the centuries fall away like layers of warm cloth, one after another, until we are standing well before the story even has a name. Because before there was Rome, there was no Rome at all. That is worth sitting with for a moment, the way you might sit with a very old and comforting idea. Before the marble and the roads and the eagles, before any of the great words that we will meet along the way, there was only this, a loop of a muddy river in the middle of a long boot-shaped land, and a scatter of low green hills standing over a wide and marshy valley. The river was the Tiber, though no one calling it that yet mattered very much, and it came down cool and unhurried from the hills of the interior and wound its slow way to the sea. The land all around was called Latium, a plain of fields and pasture and oak woods, and the endless drone of summer insects. And the people who lived there, scattered in little clusters of huts on the higher and drier ground, were shepherds and small farmers, herding their goats and their sheep and their pigs, growing their beans and their coarse grain, and they were called, simply and without any grandeur at all, the Latins. They spoke a plain and practical tongue called Latin, which at this point in the story was the private murmur of a few hill villages, and which would one day, quietly and against all reason, become the mother of Italian and Spanish and French and Portuguese and Romanian, and pour itself into fully half of the English you are drowsily understanding right now. But all of that is a very long way off, and we are in no hurry to reach it. For now it is only the speech of shepherds counting sheep. The 7 hills themselves each had a name, and I will lay them out slowly, not to test you, but because the naming of quiet places is a soothing thing to do at the edge of sleep. There was the Palatine, the central hill, the good high dry one with the pleasant air, and you may gently hold on to that one, because that is where the first furrow will be drawn. There was the Capitoline, steep and defensible, the little natural fortress, which would one day carry the greatest temple in the city, and give us, through its own name, the word capital that still sits over the seats of government in far-off lands. There was the Aventine, and the Caelian, and the Esquiline, and the Quirinal, and the Viminal. Each a low green rise with its own huts and its own paths and its own view over the reeds, and down between them all lay that marshy valley, wet and buzzing and useless, a place of frogs and standing water, which no one could have looked at and imagined would ever become the beating civic heart of an empire. But it would. That low wet valley would one day be drained and paved and crowded and called the Forum, the meeting place of the whole world, and we will watch it slowly dry out and rise before this very chapter is done. This little corner of the plain did not sit alone. Either, to the north, across the Tiber and beyond, lived a far more polished and mysterious people called the Etruscans, in a land called Etruria. The Etruscans were the sophisticates of early Italy, city builders and metal workers and traders, with a taste for fine things and a fondness for reading the future in the livers of sheep and the flight of birds, and they had learned a great deal from the wider Mediterranean. From the Etruscans the rough little Latin hill villagers would borrow, in time, an astonishing amount, the way a younger cousin borrows everything, including the arch, and the art of draining marshes, and the grand idea of building a proper temple up on a height, and even, for a stretch, their kings. And away to the south, and on the island of Sicily and dotted along the warm coasts, were the Greeks, who had sailed west long before and planted a whole ring of prosperous colonies so thick and so cultured that the Romans would later call that whole region Magna Graecia, Great Greece. The Greeks had their gods and their theatres and their philosophers and their impossibly beautiful poetry, and they too would leave their fingerprints all over the story to come. So completely, in fact, that there is a lovely and much repeated irony waiting patiently down the road for us, that Rome would one day conquer the Greeks with its armies, and then be conquered right back, utterly and permanently, by Greek art and Greek gods and Greek verse, but that too is centuries away, and I only mention it now the way you point at a distant hill you know you will reach eventually. So that is the stage, before there are any players. A muddy river, 7 quiet hills, a valley full of frogs, shepherds who speak Latin, clever cousins to the north, cultured neighbours to the south, and a great deal of ordinary weather. Now let us let the legend layer settle down over it, softly, the way mist settles into the low ground at dusk, because the Romans, when they came to be a great people and wanted to tell themselves where they had come from, did not tell a story about beans and shepherds. They told a story about gods and wanderers and wolves, and it is a good story, and it does not need to be true to be worth resting inside of. The Romans said that long, long before their city, on the far side of the sea, the great city of Troy had fallen, and out of its burning ruin came a wandering hero named Aeneas, carrying his old father upon his back, and leading his little son by the hand, one of the tenderest images the ancient world ever made. A man saving not treasure but the generations, the one behind him and the one before. Aeneas wandered the sea for years, so the poet Virgil would one day sing in the long poem called the Aeneid, driven by storms and by the moods of the gods, until at last he came to the coast of Italy, to Latium, to this very plain and settled. And his line took root in the land. And down through the generations of that line the story goes, there came at last a pair of twin boys, Romulus and Remus, and here the tale turns tender and strange the way old founding tales do. The twins were royal children, but they were unwanted, a danger to a jealous king, and so they were taken as newborns and set adrift on the Tiber in a basket, left to the mercy of the water. But the river was gentle with them. It carried the basket softly and set it down among the reeds at the foot of the hills, and there, in the oldest and most beloved image in all of Roman memory, the crying infants were found not by a person, but by a wolf. A she-wolf, a lupa, came down to the water to drink, and instead of harming the children she gathered them in and let them nurse, and kept them warm, and so the two boys who had found the fiercest city in the world were saved by the tenderness of a wild animal, and every Roman ever after would carry that picture in their heart, the wolf and the two small children beneath her, and set it in bronze and in stone all over their city, as if to remind themselves that even they had once been helpless and had once been shown mercy. In time a herdsman found the twins and raised them as his own among the huts and the flocks, and they grew up strong and well-liked and entirely unaware of who they were, until the day came, as it always does in these tales, when they learnt their true birth and set the old wrong right, and decided that they would found a city of their own, up on the good high ground above the river where the wolf had kept them. And here the story gives us its first small shadow, gently, without dwelling on it. The two brothers could not agree on which hill, and they watched the sky for a sign from the gods to settle it, and the signs were read differently, and in the quarrel that followed Remus was killed, and Romulus was left alone to found the city, and to give it his own name. Rome, from Romulus. The Romans never hid this from themselves, that their city began in a quarrel between brothers, and they told it plainly, and we can tell it plainly too, and let it go. Softly, the way you let go of a heavy thought at the end of the day. What matters for the calm of our story is the founding itself, and the founding was a beautiful, deliberate thing. On the Palatine Hill, the good dry central one you were holding on to earlier, Romulus is said to have marked out the line of his city walls by yoking a bull and a cow to a plough, and cutting a single sacred furrow all the way around the hilltop, lifting the plough only where the gates would be. A city begun not with a sword, but with a furrow in the earth, which is a farmer's founding, and very fitting for a people who would always, no matter how grand they became, love to imagine themselves as sturdy folk who smelled of soil and sheep. The traditional year of that founding was fixed by the Romans, long afterward. At 753 years before the counting of our own years began, a date they held to with great affection, 753, the birthday of the city, celebrated every spring. And the new little city had almost at once a very practical problem, which was that it was full of men and short of families, a rough settlement of herdsmen and wanderers, and the sort of restless young men who go to new places, and so, in the next of the old stories, the Romans arranged a great festival and invited their neighbours the Sabines, a nearby hill people, and in the course of it carried off the Sabine young women to be their wives. It is not a gentle episode, and I will not linger in it, but its ending is the part the Romans truly treasured, because when the outraged Sabine men came in arms to take their daughters and sisters back, it was the women themselves, now with homes and children among the Romans, who walked between the two lines of spears and stopped the fighting, and out of it came not a conquest, but a merging. The Romans and the Sabines simply deciding to become one people, sharing the hills, sharing the rule. And that, quietly, is the truest thing about Rome, hidden inside a legend. Rome grew not so much by brilliance or by sudden genius, as by absorbing, by taking in other people's and other people's gods and other people's skills, and simply making them Roman. It is a city that begins by merging, and it will go on merging, patiently, for 1,000 years. Now let the wolf and the furrow and the Sabines fade back into the mist, and let us walk forward through the age of the kings, calmly, not as a drama but as a long, slow season, because that is truly how it should be told. For after Romulus, the Romans remembered a line of 7 kings in all, ruling one after another across the first 2.5 centuries of the city, and we need not fret over every one, but a few deserve a slow and grateful mention. Romulus was the founder and the first, the man of the furrow and the walls, remembered as a warrior and an organizer, the one who gathered the scattered into a single people and gave them their first shape. And after him, most beloved of all the early kings, came Numa Pompilius, and if Romulus was the king of the wall and the spear, Numa was the king of the calm evening. Numa was remembered as the peaceful king, a wise and unhurried Sabine, and it was Numa, the Romans said, who gave the young city almost everything that was not made of stone. He gave it its religion, ordering the worship of the gods and appointing the priests to tend it. He is said to have shaped the earliest Roman calendar, dividing the year and marking out the days that were for work and the days that were for rest and reverence. Which is a fine thing to be remembered for, the man who decided which nights the lamps should burn late in celebration. He fostered the household faith, the quiet gods of the doorway and the hearth, the lares and the penates, the little protecting spirits that every Roman family, from the poorest hut to the grandest house yet to come, would keep in a small shrine by the door and honour with a few grains and a drop of wine. A warm and homely religion of the threshold that would outlast every empire built on top of it. Under Numa, the tradition says, the doors of the Temple of War stood closed for many long years, and the city simply grew and farmed and prayed and rested. It is exactly the kind of reign one wants to hear about at bedtime, a reign in which, gloriously, almost nothing happens. The Romans of later, busier centuries would look back at Numa and his long quiet years with a kind of homesickness, the way a tired person remembers a slow childhood summer, and they would tell each other that this was how a city ought to feel, unhurried and reverent and well-ordered, every day and every night given its proper place. And between Numa and the last of the kings there were others, told more briefly in the old memory, a warlike king who widened the little city's borders, a builder king who threw the first bridge across the Tiber and founded the port down at the river's mouth where it met the sea, a king who is remembered for expanding the city to take in more of the hills and their people, each of them adding a little more to the slow accumulation. A bridge here, a wall there, another hill folded into the whole, so that the city thickened and settled and spread the way a tree thickens, ring by ring, in no particular hurry, asking nobody's permission, simply growing. And through these years, slowly that useless marshy valley between the hills began to change. The kings and their people set about draining it, digging the great channels that would carry the standing water and the frogs away down to the river, and as the ground dried the people came down off their separate hills to meet on the new firm common ground between them, and the space became a market, and a meeting place, and the beating civic heart of the city, and it was called the Forum. Try to picture it drying out slowly across the years, the reeds giving way to trodden earth, the trodden earth to stalls and shrines, the frog-loud silence giving way to the murmur of a whole people gathering to trade and argue and pray, and know that this same patch of ground will be the centre of the world within our story, and that we will return to it again and again in the chapters to come. Toward the middle of the Age of Kings, the throne passed for a time into the hands of rulers of Etruscan blood, those clever cousins from the north, and this too was a gift, though it did not always feel like one. The Etruscan kings brought their engineering and their grandeur down onto the 7 hills. They taught Rome, or perfected in Rome, the arch, that simple and profound curve of wedged stones that holds itself up by leaning inward, the shape that would one day carry Roman roads over rivers and Roman water across whole valleys and stand, in places, still today. They deepened the great drain of the Forum. They began the huge temple up on the Capitoline Hill, the temple to Jupiter, greatest of the gods, that would crown the city's little fortress and give the Romans a place to look up to. Under the Etruscan kings the muddy town began, for the first time, to look like a city. They laid out the space of the great racing ground in the long valley below the Palatine, where one day crowds beyond counting would gather. They gave the young city something of their own love of ceremony and spectacle, their purple bordered robes and their ivory chairs and their processions, much of which the Romans would keep and cherish long after they had forgotten where it came from, which is a very Roman thing to do, to take a neighbour's finery, wear it for 1,000 years, and call it their own ancestral custom. And it is worth pausing to notice, softly, that Rome at this point is already doing the thing it will always do best. It is not inventing so much as it is gathering. Its arch is half Etruscan, its gods will soon be half Greek. Its very kings, for a stretch, are foreigners. And rather than being troubled by this, the Romans will build their whole long identity on it, on the patient, unglamorous, endlessly effective habit of taking in whatever works and making it Roman, and this quiet talent for absorption, more than any battle or any hero, is the real engine of everything that is coming. And then, gently, we come to the last of the 7, and to the quiet turning that ends this first long chapter. The last king was Tarquin, called Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus, and the name tells the whole of it. He was an Etruscan king who ruled without the old care, who grew heavy-handed and high-handed, who took what he wanted and listened to no one, and forgot that even a king in early Rome ruled among a proud and watchful people who remembered how to govern themselves. The Romans told a particular story of the final wrong, of a grave injury done by the royal house to a noble and blameless woman named Lucretia, an injury so shameful that it broke whatever patience the people had left, and a nobleman named Brutus, Lucius Junius Brutus, whose name you should hold gently apart from a much more famous Brutus, who will come along many centuries later at the other end of the Republic. This Brutus stood up and led the people in simply, finally, turning away from the whole idea of kings. There was no long war of it in the telling. There was a wrong, and a swelling of quiet anger, and then a decision, calm and enormous, that no one man should ever again be king over Rome. Tarquin the Proud was sent away, out of the city, into exile, and the door of monarchy was shut behind him, and it stayed shut in the Roman mind for the rest of their history, so that centuries later the very word king would remain, to a Roman, one of the ugliest words there was, a thing to be feared and refused. And in the place of the one king the Romans set up something new and careful and deeply their own. They decided that the power the king had held would be given instead to 2 men, not 1, called consuls, so that each could check the other, and that these 2 would hold their great office for a single year only, and then step down and hand it on, so that no one could settle into power and let it harden into a throne again. 2 men, 1 year, and then home again. It was a cautious, sober, almost stubborn arrangement, invented by farmers who trusted no one with too much for too long, and it would become the frame on which the Romans hung a way of governing themselves that lasted, in one form or another, for the next 500 years. Alongside the 2 consuls they kept a council of their elders and their leading families, a body of grave and experienced men to advise and to steady, which they called the Senate, from an old word that simply meant the old men, the greybeards, the ones who had seen enough seasons to be worth listening to. And in time the wider body of the people would have their voice as well, their assemblies where they gathered to vote. So that power in the new republic was never meant to sit in one place but to be shared out and balanced. The magistrates who acted, the Senate that advised, the people who chose, each leaning on the others the way the stones of an arch lean inward and hold. It was not tidy, and it was not always fair, and much of the story still to come is the story of the Romans quarrelling, slowly and mostly peaceably, over how the sharing should really work. But the shape of it was set here, on this hinge, in the deep conviction, born from the memory of one proud king, that the affairs of a whole people should belong to that whole people, and never again to a crown. The Romans gave this new thing a name we will carry through every chapter to come. They called it the Republic, the Res Publica, the public thing, the Commonwealth. the affair of the whole people rather than the property of any one man. And so we close this first evening at that quiet, momentous hinge in the year that the Romans counted as 509 before our own reckoning began. The kings are gone, the city stands on its 7 hills, the forum dried and rising between them, the great temple crowning the capital, the arch and the drain learned, the household gods burning low in 1,000 little doorway shrines, and the people, for the first time, holding their own governing in their own hands. Out on the Palatine, where a wolf once warmed 2 children and a farmer once drew a furrow with a bull and a cow, the huts have become houses, and the houses look down over a city that no longer belongs to any king. And by the slow brown river, on the edge of it all, a single small oil lamp still burns in a doorway, leaning and steadying in the warm dark, keeping its patient watch. Exactly as it did at the beginning of our story on the empty hill, before there was any city at all. It does not know what is coming. It only knows that it is evening, and that it is lit, and that the long night of Rome's self-rule is just now, quietly, beginning. Rest here. The Republic is founded, and the lamp still burns, and there is a great deal of story still to come, but none of it, tonight, is anything you have to stay awake for. And so the little town on the 7 hills stepped into its long self-rule, and the lamp went on burning by the Tiber, and the water of the river went on sliding past in the dark the way it always had, patient and unbothered, carrying the reflection of that one small flame away downstream toward the sea. It is here that our story truly settles into its stride, for the age of kings is over now, and what follows is the slow, unhurried, almost accidental growth of a small farming republic into the master of an entire sea. Nobody planned it. Nobody in those early years, standing barefoot in the mud of the forum with a bundle of onions under one arm, could possibly have imagined it. And that, perhaps, is the gentlest and most reassuring thing about the whole long tale of Rome, that it was not built by a single dazzling mind in a single dazzling stroke, but grew the way a tree grows, ring by ring, year by year, one quiet stubborn season at a time. Let us watch it grow. Let the lamp grow dim, and let us watch it grow. In the beginning of the Republic, the shape of the thing was very simple, and it is worth turning it over slowly in the mind like a smooth stone before we set it down. The Romans had decided, firmly and forever, that no one man should ever again be called king. The word itself, rex, became a kind of curse to them, a thing you did not wish upon your neighbour. So in place of a king they chose 2 men, and gave them the old royal power, but only between the 2 of them, and only for a single year, and then they had to give it back and let 2 new men take their turn. These 2 were called consuls, and there were always 2 of them precisely so that neither could grow too tall, for each could quietly halt the other simply by saying no. It was a system built, you might say, out of a deep and thorough distrust of any single person having a good day at anyone else's expense, and it worked, in its slow creaking way, for a very long time. Above the consuls, and around them and outlasting them all, sat the Senate. The Senate was a gathering of elders, of the heads of the old families and the men who had already served, and it did not command so much as advise, and yet its advice had a weight that was very hard to push aside, because it was old, and because it remembered, and because in Rome the memory of how things had always been done carried more authority than almost anything else. And then spread out beyond the Senate there were the assemblies of the people, the ordinary citizens gathering in their groups to vote, to choose their officers and to say yes or no to the laws laid before them. 2 consuls, the Senate of elders, the assemblies of the people. Out of these 3 things, balanced against one another, tugging gently at one another, the Republic made itself. And the Romans had a set of letters for all of it, 4 letters that they carved on their standards and their stones and their public works, that you may still see today pressed into old marble across what was once their world. The letters were S, P, Q, and R, and they stood for a short phrase in the Latin tongue, Senatus Populusque Romanus, which means simply the Senate and the people of Rome. Not the King of Rome, not the ruler of Rome, the Senate and the people of Rome together, as though the city itself were a single living thing that governed itself. They loved that phrase. They carried it into battle and stamped it onto drainpipes with exactly the same solemn pride. And there is something rather lovely in a people who will engrave the dignity of the entire state upon a length of municipal plumbing. Underneath all of it, older than the Republic and older even than the kings, ran a thing the Romans called the mos maiorum, which means the way of the ancestors, the custom of the elders, the manner in which things had always been done. It was not written down anywhere. It was not a law you could point to. It was simply the vast, quiet, inherited sense of how a proper Roman ought to behave, with gravity, with duty, with respect for the gods and the dead, and the family and the state, and with a deep suspicion of anything too new, too clever, or too eager. The mos maiorum was the riverbed along which the whole of Roman life flowed, and even as the centuries carried them into wars and empires and things their grandfathers could never have dreamed of, the Romans went on measuring themselves against it, always feeling, a little guiltily, that the ancestors had probably done it better. Now, a republic on paper and a republic in the living flesh are two very different creatures, and the early republic had within it, from its very first breath, a long and patient quarrel that would take it more than 200 years to work through, for the people of Rome were not one smooth mass. They were divided into two great sorts. There were the patricians, the old aristocratic families, the ones who traced their names back to the first days, and who held, at the start, nearly all the priesthoods, and nearly all the offices, and nearly all the say. And there were the plebeians, the ordinary many, the farmers, the craftsmen, the traders, the soldiers who filled the ranks, who did the great bulk of the living and the working and the dying, and who found, in those first years, that they had remarkably little say in a city they largely were. This long, slow, mostly peaceful tug between the two was called, by later writers, the struggle of the orders, and it is one of the quietest revolutions in all of history. Because for the most part it was won not with blood, but with absence. The plebeians discovered that they had one enormous and simple power. They could leave. When they felt themselves too badly used, they would gather up their families and their tools and simply walk out of the city, out onto one of the nearby hills, and sit down there and wait, and decline to work or fight or fill the ranks until they were heard. And the patricians, standing about in a suddenly very quiet city with the fields untended and the army half empty, would come out to the hill and talk, and give a little ground and coax them back. It happened more than once over the years, this great collective shrug, this walking away, and each time the plebeians came back with a little more than they had left with. In time they won the right to have officers of their very own, called tribunes of the people, whose whole purpose was to protect the ordinary citizen, men whose persons were held sacred, who could stand in the path of an unjust act and stop it simply by objecting, and whose doors, by custom, stood open day and night, so that any citizen might come for help. And they won too, after long asking, the thing that people who feel themselves at the mercy of the powerful have always most wanted, which is to see the rules written down. For in the early days the laws lived only in the memories and the mouths of the patrician judges, which is a wonderfully convenient arrangement if you happen to be the one remembering them. So a set of men was appointed to gather the laws together and set them out in plain sight, and around the middle of the century that we would count as the 400s before our era, they produced the 12 tables, the first written laws of Rome, engraved and set up in the forum, in the open, for anyone who could read to read. They were not gentle laws, many of them, and they concerned themselves with dull and homely things, debts and boundaries and inheritances, and the straying of one man's animals onto another man's field, but they were public, and they were the same for the one reading them as for the one who wrote them, and every Roman child for centuries afterward would learn them by heart. The root of an enormous tree was going into the ground there in the forum, and that tree is the law under which a great part of the world still lives, though almost none of us, reaching for it, ever think of a dozen bronze tablets standing in the mud of a small Italian town, And while all this careful, patient, indoor work of building a republic went on, the Romans kept close to their hearts a particular picture of themselves, a story they loved to tell that captured everything they most admired. It was the story of a man named Cincinnatus. He was, in the telling, an old-fashioned Roman of the very best kind, a man who had been great in the city and had then gone home to a small farm across the Tiber, where he worked his few acres with his own hands, as poor and as honest as any of his neighbours. And in an hour of danger, when the city needed a single steady head to see it through, the Senate sent messengers out to his little farm, and they found him at his plough, in the field sweating with the dirt of the furrow on his arms, and they told him the city had chosen him to be dictator, for in a true emergency the Romans would, very reluctantly, set aside their 2 consuls and hand all power to one man, but only for a fixed short spell, and only until the danger passed. Cincinnatus wiped his hands and put on his toga and went into the city and took up the whole power of the state, and used it to meet the danger and set things right. And then, and this is the part the Romans loved, the part that made them go quiet and proud when they told it, when the work was done, he laid the power down. He did not keep it a day longer than he needed it. He handed it back, whole and untarnished, and he walked out of the city and back over the Tiber to his little farm, and picked up his plough where he had left it, and went back to his furrow. That was the Roman ideal in a single picture, power taken up only out of duty, held only as long as needed, and then given back without a backward glance, so that a man might return to the honest quiet of his own field. Whether it happened exactly so, no one can now say, and it hardly matters. It was true in the way that the stories a people tell about themselves are true, which is to say it told the Romans who they wished to be, and for a long time the wishing kept them close to it. Now let us lift our eyes from the forum and the farm and look at the wider land, for while Rome was slowly settling its own household, it was also, just as slowly, growing out into Italy. And it did this in a way that was patient almost past belief, not in one great sweep of conquest, but city by city, valley by valley, one long lifetime after another. Rome would quarrel with a neighbouring town, and fight it, and beat it, or sometimes lose to it and come back and beat it later, and then, instead of destroying it or carrying its people off, Rome would very often do the strangest and cleverest thing. It would make the beaten neighbour into a kind of partner. It would offer terms and alliance, and sometimes even a share, small at first, in what it meant to be Roman, and it would bind the old enemy into its own growing body and set it to work. Enemies became allies, and allies, over the generations, became Romans, until the difference wore away. This was the quiet genius of the place, worth far more than any single battle. The endless, patient absorbing of others, the turning of the stranger into the citizen, and running out from the city to hold it all together came the roads. The Romans built roads the way other peoples build monuments, with a seriousness that bordered on love, dug down deep in layers of stone and gravel and packed earth, cambered so the rain ran off, laid arrows straight across marsh and hill, because a Roman road did not much care what stood in its way. The first of the great ones ran south from the city, and more followed, year by year, reaching out like the spokes of a slow wheel, and along them went the soldiers and the traders and the messengers and the settlers, so that a colony of Romans planted at the far end was never truly far away. All roads lead to Rome, the saying would one day go, and it was very nearly the plain truth. For the roads were the veins of the thing, and they were built to last, and some of them are being walked on, gently worn and grass-grown, to this very day. And it is worth pausing here, in the quiet of the Middle Republic, to think what the ordinary life of these people was like, for they were not, most of them, generals or senators, but farmers and their families, living close to the soil and close to the turning of the year. A Roman of these centuries was, above all else, a man of the land. He rose before the light and went out to his fields, to the wheat and the barley, to the vines climbing their poles and the grey-green olive trees on the slopes, and he worked with his hands until the sun was low. And he counted his wealth in acres and in animals and in sturdy grown sons. His wife kept the house and the hearth and the spinning, and the whole household turned morning and evening to a small shrine set by the door, the Lararium they called it. The home of the household gods, the Lares and the Penates who watched over the family and the store cupboard and the fire. Before that little shrine they left small offerings, a few grains, a splash of wine, a crumb of bread, and asked, in the plain way of country people everywhere, only that things go on much as they were, that the harvest come in, that the children stay well, that the ancestors rest content. It was a religion not of grand ideas, but of homely daily care, of doing the right small things in the right old order, and it fitted the Roman temper perfectly. And into this steady rural world the widening republic brought its slow changes, its colonies and its roads and its new towns laid out in the tidy Roman way, each with its straight main streets crossing at the centre, its open square for market and law, its temple on the high ground. Wherever the legions and the settlers went, a little Rome grew up, a small ordered image of the great one, until the whole of Italy was stitched together, not only by the roads, but by these 1,000 quiet echoes of the mother city. This was how Rome truly conquered, not merely by winning the battle, but by planting the town, and by making, over the patient generations. The far valley feel that it too was Roman. So by slow degrees the town on the 7 hills became the mistress of the whole long boot of Italy, from the cool green foot of the Alps down to the warm Greek south, and it did it, on the whole, without ever quite meaning to, one reluctant war and one generous peace at a time. And then, at last, across the water, Rome met something its own size. Away to the south, on the far shore of the sea, in what is now North Africa, stood the great city of Carthage, old, rich and mighty, a city of traders and sailors whose ships knew every corner of the western sea, and whose merchants had grown fat on its trade long before Rome was anything but mud. The Carthaginians were descended from the Phoenicians, the ancient sea people of the eastern shore, and the Romans, in their own tongue, called anything to do with them Punic, from that old Phoenician root. And so the long struggle between these two great powers, stretched across more than 100 years and 3 separate wars, is remembered as the Punic Wars, the largest thing by far that Rome had ever taken on, a contest between a nation of soldiers who owned the land and a nation of sailors who owned the sea. The first of the 3 wars began, in the counting of years before our own era, a little over 260 years before that counting starts, and it was a long, grinding, wearisome affair, and it was mostly about the great island of Sicily, that lies like a stone kicked from the toe of Italy, and about who should hold it. And here Rome learned a hard and expensive lesson, for Rome was a power of the land, and this was to be a war of the sea, and Rome had almost no ships and hardly knew how to sail them. But the Romans were nothing if not stubborn, and they did a very Roman thing. They took a wrecked enemy warship that had run aground, and they copied it, plank by plank, and built themselves a fleet from the pattern of it, and then they taught farmers to row. They lost fleets to storms, whole fleets, drowned by the 1,000, and they simply gritted their teeth and built more, and lost those and built more again, until at last, by sheer refusal to stop, they wore the sea masters down and won. The first war ended with Carthage beaten and Sicily passing to Rome, and it left both cities exhausted and neither one truly reconciled. And out of that unfinished quarrel, a generation later, came the Second Punic War, which is the greatest and most famous of the 3, and which brought to the stage the one enemy the Romans never quite got over, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal. Hannibal is one of those figures history does not easily set down, for he was a soldier of genius, patient and daring and deep, who had hated Rome since boyhood, and who spent his whole life bending himself against it. And he did a thing that no one thought could be done. Rome expected the war to come by sea, and guarded the sea. So Hannibal came by land. He gathered his army in Spain in the far west, and he marched it the whole long way around the top of the sea, and then he brought it up against the great cold wall of the Alps, those enormous mountains roofed in snow that shut Italy off from the north, and he took his army over them. he took men and horses and even a troop of war elephants up into the ice and the thin air and the falling stone. And many died, and the elephants suffered pitifully in the cold. And yet he came down the far side into the north of Italy with an army still at his back, appearing where no enemy was ever supposed to appear. And for years afterward he ranged up and down Italy, and again the Romans marched out against him in their strength, and again he outfought them and broke them, until in one terrible day of battle at a place called Cannae, he destroyed a Roman army so vast that there was scarcely a family in the city that did not lose someone. That was the darkest hour of the whole Republic. The hour when it seemed the great gamble of Rome might simply end, there in the dust, with Hannibal loose in Italy and the flower of a generation gone. And here again the Romans showed the one quality that, more than any cleverness, carried them through their whole history. They would not give up. They would not retreat. They would not surrender. They would not admit that they had lost even when by every reasonable measure they had. They raised new armies out of boys and old men. They learned, painfully, to stop marching out to be beaten, and instead to shadow Hannibal, and starve him of victories, and wear at him, and wait. For Hannibal, brilliant as he was far from home, and could not easily be reinforced, and could not take the city itself, and so year by year his great feet slowly curdled into a long, grinding stalemate, a genius with no way to finish. And while he grew slowly weaker in Italy, a young Roman rose who at last had learned how to fight him, a general named Scipio, who would later be given the proud surname Africanus for what he did. And Scipio did the coolest, cleverest thing of all. Instead of chasing Hannibal round and round Italy, he took an army across the sea and struck straight at Carthage itself, at the enemy's own home. So that Carthage, in terror, had to call its great general back from Italy to defend it. And so, after all those years, the two of them at last stood face to face on African soil, at a place called Zama, and there Scipio beat Hannibal, quietly, thoroughly and finally, and the Second Punic War was over. Carthage was left standing but broken, stripped of its fleet and its power, made small, and Rome came out of that long ordeal changed forever, no longer just the mistress of Italy, but a power that reached across the sea, hardened, confident and mistress now of the western Mediterranean. There remained a third war, and it is the saddest and the shortest of the three, and there is not much that is glorious in it. Carthage, though beaten and small and no longer any real threat, went on quietly recovering its wealth, as trading cities will, and there were men in Rome who could not bear even the sight of it, who had grown so used to fearing Carthage that they could not learn to stop. And so, on a thin pretext, more than 140 years before our era, Rome went to war one last time with the old rival that could no longer truly fight back, and this last war ended not in a battle of equals, but in a siege and a burning. The Romans took the great old city, and they levelled it, and its people were killed or carried off, and the place where Carthage had stood for 600 years was left empty. It is a hard thing to tell gently, and we will not linger on it, except to say that even the Romans, or some of them, seem to have felt the weight of what they had done, and that there is an old story of the Roman general standing in the smoke of the fallen city and weeping, not for Carthage, but at the thought that Rome itself, some day in its own far-off time, would come to the same end, as all great cities do. And in that very same year, more than 140 years before our era, far away to the east across the sea, Rome also brought the ancient and beautiful land of Greece firmly under its hand, sacking the proud Greek city of Corinth to make the lesson plain. So in a single season the two great rivals of the West and the great glory of the East both passed under Roman power. And the little town that had begun as a few huts and a lamp on a hill above a muddy river now held the whole warm circle of the Mediterranean in its grasp. A sea that the Romans would, before long, half jokingly and half in earnest, come to call simply Mare Nostrum, our sea. And here is the quiet joke that history was setting up all this while, the gentle irony that the Romans themselves came to see and to laugh at ruefully. For in conquering Greece, Rome had swallowed something far larger than a province, Greece was old where Rome was young, and subtle where Rome was plain, and it had gods and poems and philosophies and marble statues and whole libraries of thought that made the sturdy Roman farmer feel, deep down, a little rough and a little unlettered. And so the strangest thing happened. Rome conquered Greece with its legions, and then Greece, slowly and thoroughly, conquered Rome right back. With its art, its gods, its poetry, its learning, its whole finer way of seeing the world. The Romans took the Greek gods and gave them Roman names and set them in their own temples. They sent their sons to be taught by Greek tutors. They copied Greek statues, hired Greek doctors, read Greek books, and quietly rebuilt their own minds along Greek lines, all the while insisting, in the good old Roman way, that of course they preferred honest Roman plainness to all that foreign cleverness. It is one of the great gentle turns of the whole story. The conquerors conquered, the victors taken captive by the beaten, the tough little republic of soldiers falling helplessly in love with the culture of the very people it had just defeated. And so we leave Rome here, at the height of this long, slow climb, mistress of the sea and about to be gently remade by the world it had won, richer and larger and more powerful than the shepherds on the Palatine could ever have dreamed. The republic that began with 2 consuls and a distrust of kings had grown, ring by ring and war by war and road by road, into the greatest power the Western world had ever seen. And down in the old forum, drained so long ago from marsh to meeting place, among the standards and the bronze tablets of the law, the evening comes on soft and blue, and someone, as someone always does, sets a small oil lamp in a doorway by the Tiber and lets it catch, and the little flame steadies and burns, and the river slides by beneath it in the dark, patient and unbothered as ever, carrying that one small light away downstream toward the sea. The lamp burns on. Sleep now if you are ready. The story goes on, and the lamp goes on, and there is a very long night yet to come. And so we come to the years after Carthage, in the season when Rome had won almost everything a city could win, and found, as cities sometimes do, that winning is its own kind of weight. The lamp is still burning by the Tiber, the same small lamp we have carried through all these hundreds of years, its little flame leaning and steadying, and by its light we can watch a city that has grown very great and does not yet quite know what to do with its greatness. It is a little after 146 years before the counting of our own years began. Carthage is gone, its harbour silent, its fields sown over. Corinth in Greece has fallen in the very same year. The whole warm ring of the Mediterranean now leans toward Rome the way a room leans toward its one open window. And the strange, gentle truth of this chapter, the truth we will follow softly all the way to its close, is that Rome, having beaten every enemy outside her walls, will spend the next 100 years slowly, quietly, and without ever quite meaning to, wrestling with herself. Let the flame lean, let the river move. There is no hurry in any of this now. It has all already happened, a very long time ago, and we are only walking back through it in the dark, gently, the way you might walk through a house you grew up in after everyone has gone to sleep. Think first of the land itself, because the land is where this long, slow story begins. For centuries the backbone of Rome had been the small farmer, the man with a few fields of wheat and a row of olives and a handful of goats, who put down his tools when the city called and picked up a shield and went to war, and then came home again to his own furrows, the way Cincinnatus had done in the old stories, the plough left waiting in the earth. That small farmer was Rome's picture of itself, sturdy and modest and brown from the sun. But the wars that made Rome great had also, very quietly, begun to unmake that farmer. A man called away to fight in Spain, or in Greece, or across the sea in Africa, might be gone not for a season but for years, and while he was gone the weeds came up in his fields, and the roof of his little house sagged, and the debts gathered like dust in a corner. And when he came home at last, footsore and grey, he often found he could no longer make the land pay. Meanwhile the men who had grown rich from all this conquering, the senators and the great families, were buying up the empty farms one after another, stitching them together into vast estates, and working those estates not with citizen farmers, but with the enormous multitudes of enslaved people that the wars themselves had brought home in chains. This was the quiet engine underneath everything that follows, and it is worth resting on for a moment in the soft dark. War made Rome rich. The riches bought up the land. The bought-up land was worked by the conquered. And the old free farmer, the very man whose sword had won all of it, drifted off his fields and into the city, where he became one more pair of idle hands in a growing crowd, fed on public grain, and amused by public games, watching other men govern the world he had helped to win. Bread and the games, the Romans would come to call it. And it began here, in the long shadow of victory. And the city he drifted into was itself changing under the weight of all that treasure, filling with the marble and the plunder and the clever craftsmen of the lands Rome had swallowed, so that the plain old town of mud brick and timber began to put on airs, to raise columns and porticos and painted temples, to import the art and the philosophy and the graceful manners of conquered Greece. There is a gentle joke buried in all of this, and the Romans themselves came to tell it against themselves in their calmer moments, that Rome had marched out and conquered the Greeks by the sword, and had promptly been conquered right back by everything the Greeks knew about beauty, so that the masters ended up copying the slaves, learning their poetry and their sculpture and their long words for things, which is one of the quieter ways that history likes to have the last laugh. But underneath the new marble the old trouble was still there, the empty farms and the crowded city and the land locked up in a few great hands, and it was that plain trouble, and not the philosophy, that the years ahead would have to reckon with. Into this quiet trouble, gently, came two brothers. Their name was Gracchus, and we remember them together as the Gracchi, though they came one after the other, a little apart in time. The elder was Tiberius Gracchus, thoughtful and earnest, of one of the finest families in Rome, and he looked at the emptying countryside and the swelling city and thought, simply, that the land should be shared out again, that some of those vast estates might be trimmed back and the old small farms restored, so that Rome might have her sturdy farmers once more. It was not a wild idea. It was, if anything, a conservative one, a wish to put back something that had been lost. But it touched the wealth of the powerful, and the powerful did not care to be touched. And when Tiberius pressed his land law through the assembly of the people, and stood unusually to hold his office a second year so that his work might not be undone, the anger against him gathered like a summer storm, and one hot day it broke, and Tiberius Gracchus was killed in the streets of his own city by men of his own class, and his body was thrown into the Tiber. The river we have watched so calmly for so long simply carried him away, the way it carries everything, leaves and lamplight and the reflection of the moon. His younger brother Gaius Gracchus came along some years afterward, and he was fiercer and cleverer and reached further, with laws for grain and for the courts and for the founding of new colonies where the landless might begin again, and for a while it seemed the crowd loved him. But he too pressed against the great weight of the Senate and the great families, and he too was swept away in the end, hunted through the city until he chose his own quiet exit in a grove across the river, and many of his followers died with him. The brothers Gracchus achieved less in the doing than they had hoped, and their reforms were mostly rolled back like a tide. But something in Rome had changed and would not change back, something we can only see clearly from a great distance, softly, in the dark, and it is this. The Romans had discovered that the quarrels of their politics could be settled not only by votes and by argument in the forum, but by clubs and by knives and by blood in the street. That door, once opened, proved very hard to close. And now the story turns, gently, from farmers to soldiers, because the next great change came from the army. There was a man named Gaius Marius, not born to the highest families, a hard practical soldier from the country towns, and he rose by sheer ability at war in a time when Rome badly needed men who could win. And Marius, needing soldiers and finding the old class of small farmers thinned almost to nothing, did a very simple thing whose consequences would run out for centuries. he opened the army to the poorest citizens, the men with no land and no property at all, and he armed them and trained them and gave them a trade and a wage and the promise of land at the end of their service. It was practical and it was humane, and it filled the legions with willing men. But consider, softly, what it also did. A poor soldier who owned nothing, who looked to his general and not to the state for his pay and for the farm he hoped to retire to, became loyal, above all, to that general. The legions which had belonged to Rome began, very quietly, to belong to the men who led them, and so the armies of Rome became, without anyone deciding it, the private hope and the private strength of ambitious men. Marius himself was held up 6 times and more to the highest office, an old lion of a man, and beside him and then against him rose another, a cool and elegant and utterly ruthless aristocrat named Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who had served under Marius and then outgrown him. And here Rome did the thing it had never dreamed of doing. When a quarrel over who should command a war turned bitter, Sulla did what no Roman had done before. He turned his loyal army around and marched it, not against a foreign enemy, but against the city of Rome herself, in through her own gates, the eagles of the legion in the streets where only togas should walk. It is a soft and terrible hinge, this moment, and we will not dwell on the blood of it, for this is a place for sleep and not for horror. It is enough to say gently that the rivalry of Marius and Sulla filled a generation with marching and countermarching, that lists of the condemned were posted in the forum, and that when Sulla at last held all the power in his hands he took for himself the old emergency title of dictator. Not for the 6 months the ancient law allowed, but for as long as he pleased, and used it to set the Senate back on its throne and to try to freeze Rome the way it had been. And then, having done all that, Sulla did the one thing about him that the Romans could never quite explain. He laid it all down. He gave up his absolute power, walked out of public life, and retired to the country to his gardens and his dinners and his books, and died in his bed a private man. The Romans looked at that and did not know what to make of it, and neither, gently, do we. Perhaps he was simply tired. Perhaps, having proved that a Roman with an army could take the whole of Rome and hold it, he had also proved, without meaning to, that the old rules were only rules, kept by habit and by good faith, and by the long memory the Romans called the way of the ancestors, and that once a man was willing to break that faith there was nothing solid left to stop him. Sulla put the pieces back on the board just as they had been and stepped away. But everyone had seen, now, how easily the board could be swept clear, and the seeing could not be unseen. The Senate went on meeting and voting and wrapping itself in its ancient dignity, and it is one of the soft ironies of this whole century that the Senate seemed to grow more solemn and more grand in its ceremonies exactly as the real power slipped, quietly, out of its hands and into the tents of the generals, the way a household will sometimes polish the silver most carefully in the years when. The money has already gone. The lamp by the Tiber burns on through all of it, low and steady, patient as lamps are. Now while the great men marched, there rose in the south of Italy a very different story, one that the Romans found frightening at the time, and that later ages have found strangely beautiful. Among the countless enslaved people brought home from the wars, many were set to fight one another for the amusement of crowds, trained in schools of the sword, gladiators, kept like fine and dangerous animals. And in one such school, in the town of Capua, a man named Spartacus, a Thracian by birth, broke out with a small band of his fellows, armed at first with nothing but kitchen knives and the tools of the kitchen, and fled to the slopes of a sleeping mountain. And to that small band came others, and then others, the enslaved and the desperate from all across the countryside, until Spartacus led not a handful, but a great host, tens of thousands of people who wished, very simply, to be free and to go home. For 2 years and more they moved up and down the length of Italy, and again the armies sent against them were beaten, and Rome, which had faced down Hannibal himself, found herself unsettled by a rebellion of the people she had enslaved. In the end, the weight of Rome was too great, as the weight of Rome so often was, and the rising was surrounded and broken, and its story ended sorrowfully along the Great South Road. We will let it end there softly, without the grim details, only noting, gently, that of all the many names in this hard century, it is the name of the enslaved gladiator who wished only to go home that the world has remembered most tenderly, which is one of history's quiet ways of settling accounts. And so we come to the three great men whose shadows fill the last act of the Republic, and to the strange informal bargain among them that carried Rome, almost without a jolt, out of one age and into the next. The first was Pompey, called Pompey the Great, a golden and popular general who had won victory after victory in the East and cleared the sea of its pirates and come home the most admired soldier in the world, wanting, more than anything, to be loved and honoured as the first man of Rome. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, said to be the richest man in all the city, a man who had made his fortune in ways not always lovely, and who craved the one thing his money had never quite bought him, which was military glory. And the third, younger than the other two, and not yet so great as either, was Gaius Julius Caesar, of an old and proud family fallen on modest means, charming and clever and patient and endlessly in debt. A man whom the others rather underestimated, which is a mistake people made about Caesar exactly once. These three, each blocked in some way by the cautious Senate, each wanting something the others could help him reach, came quietly together in a private understanding, an unofficial and unwritten alliance to share among themselves the real direction of Rome. Later ages would call it the First Triumvirate, the rule of three men, though the three men themselves never called it anything at all, for its whole strength lay in its being unspoken. Pompey would have his honours and his soldiers' land, Crassus would have his chances at wealth and glory, and Caesar, the youngest, would have the thing he most needed, which was a great command, a province and an army of his own, far from Rome, where a man of ability might make himself. He was given the lands of Gaul to the north, the wide country of forests and rivers that is France today, and there Caesar went, and there he stayed for the better part of 10 years, and there, gently, the balance of everything shifted. For Caesar in Gaul turned out to be one of the great soldiers of the world. Year after year he campaigned across those northern lands, through country the Romans had barely known, fighting and bargaining and building bridges across broad rivers in a matter of days, extending the rule of Rome all the way to the cold channel that faces Britain, and even crossing that grey water twice to set his foot, briefly, on the misty island beyond. And all the while he wrote calm, clear accounts of what he did, and sent them home to be read in the Forum, so that the people of Rome, idle and hungry for wonders, followed his distant campaigns the way people follow a story, and came to love him. And with each year his army grew harder and more sure of itself, and more entirely his own. Veterans who had followed him through 100 camps and river crossings and cold winters far from home, who trusted him the way soldiers trust the one man who has always brought them through, and who looked to him and not to the distant Senate for their bread and their pay and the farms they hoped to rest on when the fighting was done. He was making himself, out there in the forests, into exactly what he had planned to become, the most successful and the most beloved and the most dangerous man alive, and the men in Rome who had once thought him only a charming spendthrift with too many debts began, slowly, to understand what they had let out of the gate. And while he did it, the bargain of the three men slowly came apart, as such bargains do. Crassus, chasing at last the military glory he had always envied, took an army east against a great empire beyond the desert, and there, far from home, he and his legions were destroyed, and the richest man in Rome died in a dry land a long way from his money. Which is the sort of ending the Romans found instructive, and we may find merely sad. With Crassus gone, only 2 great men remained where there had been 3, and 2 is a harder number than 3, for 3 can lean and shift and balance, but 2 can only face each other. Pompey, at home in Rome and growing uneasy at the size of Caesar's fame, drifted toward the old Senate, toward the great families who feared Caesar and wished to see him brought low, stripped of his army and his command, and made once more into an ordinary citizen who could be tried and ruined. And Caesar, away in the north with his hardened and utterly devoted legions, understood very well that to come home unarmed and alone was to come home to his own destruction. And so we arrive at the little river. It is called the Rubicon, a modest stream in the north of Italy, hardly a river at all, the sort of water you might step across in summer without wetting your knees, and it marked, in those days, a solemn boundary. On the far side lay Caesar's province, where he was a general and his army was lawful. On the near side lay Italy and Rome itself, where the law was clear and old and simple, that no general might bring his soldiers, that to cross that little water at the head of an army was to declare war upon his own country. And Caesar, on a cold night near the beginning of the year that we would count as 49 before our era, stood at the edge of that small stream with his men behind him, and thought, and paused, for even Caesar paused, and then, quietly, gave the order and stepped his army across. There was no great battle at the river, no thunder, only a general and his tired soldiers wading a shallow stream in the dark. But everything was in it. The old republic, the rule of the Senate and the people, the balance of consuls and assemblies that had held for 450 years and more, all of it turned, in that quiet crossing, toward its end. A phrase came down to us from that night, that the die was cast, the little gaming die thrown and rolling, and not yet come to rest, the choice made and beyond unmaking. Pompey and much of the Senate, unready for the speed of him, withdrew from Rome and then from Italy altogether, retreating across the sea to gather their strength, and Caesar entered the city almost gently, without the sack that everyone had feared. And then followed several years of civil war, up and down the Roman world, in Greece and in Egypt and in Africa and in Spain. Caesar and his fortune against Pompey and the Senate's cause, and we will not follow the marching of it here, for it is late, and the details are only the details. It is enough to say, softly, that Caesar won, everywhere and against everyone, with a speed that astonished the age, and that Pompey the Great, once the most admired soldier in the world, fled at the last to Egypt hoping for shelter, and was struck down on a foreign beach by men who thought to please the winner, so that Caesar, arriving after, was brought the head of his old ally and son-in-law, and is said to have wept. It was in Egypt, too, that Caesar met the queen of that ancient land, Cleopatra, clever and charming and the last of a long line of Greek kings who ruled the Nile, and their meeting would matter greatly to the years just after this chapter closes. Though we will leave that thread resting for now, coiled quietly, to be taken up another night. Caesar came home at last, the master of the Roman world, with no rival left standing anywhere upon it, and the question the whole story had been circling toward for 100 years stood plainly before him, which was what a man does with such power in a city that had thrown out its last king 4.5 centuries before, and had sworn, in its very bones, that it would never kneel to a king again. And Caesar, in the short time left to him, did a great deal, and much of it was good, and some of it we still carry with us tonight, without ever thinking of him. He was made dictator, first for a term and then, unsettlingly, for life. The old emergency office stretched into something that looked very much like the thing Rome had sworn off. He settled his veterans on land, and founded colonies across the sea, and eased the crushing debts of the poor, and enlarged the Senate, and set the crowds of the idle to useful work. And he took the calendar in hand, that muddled old Roman calendar that had drifted so far out of step with the sun that its festivals fell in the wrong seasons. And with the help of the learned men of Egypt he remade it, a steady year of 365 days, with an extra day slipped in every 4th year to keep it true. And that calendar, the Julian calendar, is very nearly the one that hangs on our walls tonight. The same 12 months, the same leap year. So that every time you turn a page of the year, you are, quietly, using the reform of a man who has been dead for 2,000 years. And one of those months, the high month of midsummer, was given his own name, Julius, which we say is July, so that even the warm nights of the year carry his name softly forward, and none of us notice. But the honours heaped upon him grew heavier and stranger, statues and titles, and a chair like a throne, and his image on the coins where only gods and the dead had gone before, and a growing number of the old proud families watched all of it, and did not like what they saw, for it looked to them less and less like a Roman magistrate, and more like a king in all but the hated name. And so a number of them, some 60 senators, gathered a plot quietly among themselves, men of the old cause, and even some who had been Caesar's own friends and had been forgiven by him, which he had thought was mercy, and which they found they could not bear. And on a day in the middle of the month we would count as March, a day the Romans called the Ides of March. In the year 44 before our era, Caesar went to a meeting of the Senate, held that day in a hall beside a great theatre, and there, among the crowd of senators in their white togas, the plotters closed around him. And it was done. We will let it be quiet. We will not count the wounds. It is enough, tonight, to see an old man in a white robe sinking down at the foot of a statue, while the men around him draw back, and the great noise of it all somehow becoming, in an instant, a great silence, and the news going out from that hall through the streets, and the forum, and out across the whole hushed city, that Caesar was dead. And the strangest thing of all, the thing to carry softly down into sleep, is that the men who killed him believed, sincerely and to their bones, that by striking him down they were saving the old republic, giving it back its liberty, restoring the rule of the Senate and the people just as it had been. But the republic they thought they were saving was already gone, and had been gone, quietly, for a long time, worn away by the long century of land and armies and great men that we have walked through together this night. It had not fallen at the Rubicon, and it did not fall in that Senate hall. It had simply, gently, over 100 slow years, ceased to be able to hold itself up, so that when they took away the one man who was holding it, they found there was nothing underneath. Rome that spring was grieving and frightened and utterly uncertain, mourning a man half of it had loved and half of it had feared, waiting to see what would rise out of the confusion, not yet knowing, none of them knowing, that a quiet and careful young man, Caesar's own heir, was already turning his face toward the city. But that is the next night's story, and we will leave it coiled and resting, like the great river itself. For now there is only the grieving city under its stars, and the old forum full of low voices, and the boundary between one age of the world and the next passing over Rome, as softly as a shadow passes over grass. And the lamp, our one small lamp on its table by the Tiber, burns on through it all, low and warm and untroubled, the way it burned when there were only huts on the hills, and the way it will go on burning through everything still to come, steady in the dark, a small gold flame beside a slow dark river, leaning and steadying, while the great story turns its page. And so we come to the long warm afternoon of the whole story, the part where the noise of the falling republic settles at last into something like a hush, and the little town on the 7 hills becomes, for a while, the calm centre of the known world. We left the old republic grieving and uncertain, the great man fallen in the Senate house on the Ides of March, the lamp still burning by the Tiber. Let us pick that lamp back up now, gently, and carry it forward into the years that follow, the way you might carry a small light from one quiet room into the next, and let the tale go on. After Caesar was gone there was, for a while, only confusion. The ordinary confusion of a house whose master has died, without saying clearly who should hold the keys. There was a boy, or very nearly a boy, a grand-nephew of Caesar named Octavian, a slight, pale, unhurried young man who did not look at all like the future of the world. And there was a great soldier named Mark Antony, Marcus Antonius, broad and popular and fond of wine and of Caesar's memory, who felt the keys should be his. For a long stretch of years these two circled one another across the Roman world, sometimes as friends, sometimes as rivals, and the tired old republic, which had bled quite enough already, watched them the way a household watches two heirs argue softly over the will. It would be easy to tell this part as a storm. We shall not. We shall tell it as weather that came and went, far out over the sea, while the olives ripened and the bread was baked and the river slid by as it always had. Mark Antony went east into the warm and gilded world of the old Greek kingdoms, and there he met Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, the last of a long line of Greek rulers who sat on the throne of the pharaohs beside the mouths of the Nile. She was clever and charming and immensely rich, and Egypt was the great granary of the world, the land whose fields fed the hungry cities, and Antony, in her company, began to look less like a Roman soldier and more like an Eastern king. And the young, patient Octavian, back in Italy, let him. That was the whole of Octavian's quiet genius in a way. He let other men be loud. He waited. When at last the two sides came to their reckoning, it was out on the water, off the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, in the year we would count as 31 before our own years began. And even the great battle, when it came, was strangely soft in its ending. Antony's ships and Cleopatra's ships and Octavian's ships turned and gathered on the grey-green sea under a wide sky, and there was a fight, and then, before it was even fully decided, Cleopatra's squadron slipped away south toward Egypt, and Antony followed her, and the thing simply came apart. The two of them sailed home to Alexandria, and there, not long after, first one and then the other chose to leave the world by their own hand rather than be led through Rome in chains. And Egypt, oldest of kingdoms, passed quietly into Roman keeping and became the private granary of one man. And that one man was Octavian, standing now entirely alone at the very top of the Roman world, the last figure left upright after 100 years in which every other tall figure had fallen. He was still not yet 40. He had learned, watching all of them fall, exactly how a Roman came to grief, and it was almost always the same way. A Roman came to grief by wanting to be called king, or by looking as though he wanted it, in a city that had thrown out its kings 500 years before and had never once forgotten the day it did so. The word for king, in Latin, was a word that curdled in a Roman mouth. So Octavian did the wisest and quietest thing anyone in the whole long story ever did. He simply did not use the word. He gave the Republic back. He stood before the Senate and, with every appearance of weariness and modesty, laid down his powers and handed the state back to the Senate and the people of Rome, to the old letters, the spur, the Senate and the people, and asked only to be allowed to serve as an ordinary leading citizen. And the Senate, who understood the game as well as he did, begged him, of course, to keep just a few of his powers, only for the good of the state, only for a little while, and he allowed himself, with visible reluctance, to be persuaded. They gave him a new name to wear instead of king. They called him Augustus, which means something like the revered one, the one touched with a quiet holiness, and they called him, more modestly still, the first citizen, the princeps, the one who goes first, and it is from that gentle little word, princeps, that our own heavier word prince comes rolling down the centuries. So the Republic did not end with a crash. It ended with a bow. It ended with everyone in the room agreeing to pretend, with great courtesy, that nothing had changed at all, that the consuls were still elected, and the Senate still ruled, and the assemblies still met, while one calm man at the centre quietly held the loyalty of every legion, the grain of Egypt, and the purse of the world. The Romans got to keep all their beloved old words, and Augustus got to keep everything the words used to mean. It was, when you look at it, an extraordinarily Roman solution, and it worked so well that we still argue 2,000 years later about the exact hour at which the Republic became the Empire, because there was never any single hour. There was only a very patient man, and a Senate that voted itself a great deal of dignity in the very years that it was quietly handing away the last of its power, which is a thing that tends to happen more often in this world than anyone likes to admit. And out of all this quiet arranging came something the Roman world had not known in living memory, and would tell stories about for centuries afterward. It came peace. Not perfect peace, not peace on every distant edge, for the legions still watched the far rivers and the far deserts. But at the heart of things, across the whole wide warm circle of the Mediterranean, the fighting between Romans simply stopped, and stayed stopped, for longer than anyone then alive could remember. Men called it, afterward, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and it is one of the gentlest things in all of history to lie and think about in the dark. Imagine it. For the better part of 200 years, a person could set out from the grey, rainy edge of Britain in the far northwest and travel, by good stone roads and safe bright sea lanes, all the way to the hot yellow deserts of Syria and Egypt in the far southeast, and never once leave Roman ground, never once change their money, never once step outside the reach of a single body of law. One coin in the purse, minted with one calm face, spent the same in a wet northern market town and in a sun-baked eastern port. One tongue, Latin, for law and the army and the West, and its elder sister Greek for learning and trade and the East, would carry a traveller the whole enormous way. The roads ran straight over the hills, and the aqueducts marched their arches across the valleys, carrying cool water into the towns, and the ships came and went from the harbours loaded with grain and oil and wine and marble, and over all of it lay a long, warm, unhurried quiet, the quiet of a world that had for once laid down its weapons and had a little time to think. And Augustus filled that quiet with beautiful things. He was a builder, and a patron of builders and of poets, and he liked to say, near the end of his long life, that he had found Rome a city of brick, and left it a city of marble. And the saying was more or less true. He drained and paved and raised and gilded, he set up temples with bright painted roofs and cool white columns, he laid out forums and gathering places, and he gathered around himself the finest poets the Latin tongue would ever produce. There was Virgil, grave and gentle, who gave Rome its great founding poem, the tale of Aeneas the wandering Trojan sailing at last to Italy to plant the seed from which all of this would one day grow, so that the new age could look back and see its own beginnings shining. There was Horace, wry and warm and wise, who wrote short perfect poems about wine and friendship and the shortness of life and the great good sense of not worrying too much about tomorrow, which is advice as fit for falling asleep to now as it was then. And there was Ovid, playful and clever and a little too fond of mischief for the taste of Augustus, who in the end sent him away to a cold town on the far edge of the sea, so that even in the golden afternoon there was a little melancholy at the edges, as there always is. Augustus lived a very long time, longer than almost anyone expected of that slight, pale young man who had waited so patiently at the beginning. He ruled, in the quiet way he had invented, for over 40 years, until he was an old man, and the whole Roman world had by then quite forgotten what it was like to be governed by anyone else. When he died at last, in the year we count as 14 after the turning of the years, in a bed of old age, which was itself a small marvel for a Roman leader, the peace held. The power passed, not to an elected consul, for that fiction was wearing thin, but to a man of his own household, his stepson Tiberius, and with that quiet passing the thing became, at last, and without anyone quite saying so, a throne, and the family that sat upon it we call the Julio-Claudians, after the two old proud names, Julius and Claudius, that ran together in their blood. We will walk through them gently, the way you walk through a portrait gallery in the evening when the light is low, pausing at each face just long enough to see it, and then moving softly on. For their story has its cruelties, and this is not the hour for cruelties. There was Tiberius, the second of them, able and sour and lonely, a good soldier and a reluctant ruler, who governed well enough for many years and then wearied of Rome and its scheming, and retired to an island to live out his days looking at the sea, and left the great machine to run itself, which for a while it did. There was, after him, the young man we remember by his soldier's nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots, a name a laughing army had given him as a child in the camps. He began bright and beloved, and became in a very short time something the Romans could not manage at all, and after less than 4 years the household guard quietly ended his reign in a corridor, and the thing was done. And here the story turns almost tender, for after Caligula, the guards, looking about for someone of the family to raise up, are said to have found a middle-aged man of the household hiding behind a curtain, a man everyone had always taken for a harmless fool, who stammered and limped and buried himself in old books, and whom no one had ever thought worth the trouble of murdering, precisely because no one had ever thought him worth anything at all. His name was Claudius, and he turned out, to the great surprise of everyone who had spent their lives underestimating him, to be one of the shrewdest and most capable rulers the age produced. He built harbours and roads and aqueducts, he governed carefully, he added the far green island of Britain to the empire at last, and he reminds us of the gentle truth, easy to forget, that the quiet, overlooked one in the corner is very often the one who has been paying attention. And then, last of that line, came Nero, who is remembered above all for a single night. In the year we count as 64 after the turning of the years, a fire began among the wooden shops near the great racing track, the circus, and it spread, as fire does in a crowded city of narrow lanes and timber upper floors, and it burned for days, and a great part of Rome was laid in ash. People said afterward, whether truly or not, that the emperor had sung and played while the city burned, and the saying stuck to his name the way soot sticks to a wall, and has never quite come off. Whatever the truth of that night, the city was rebuilt, and rebuilt better, with wider streets and safer stone, for a city is a patient thing, and knows how to rise from its own ashes, having done it more than once. But Nero's own thread ran out not long after, and with him the long line that had begun with the patient Augustus came quietly to its end, for he left no son, and the name that had ruled the world for 100 years simply stopped. There was a short unsettled time then, a single year in which several soldiers reached for the purple in turn and let it fall, the way a tired household passes through a brief loud quarrel over the estate before a firmer hand takes charge. And a firmer hand did take charge. His name was Vespasian, and he was not born to any of it. He was a plain, blunt, humorous old soldier from a modest country family, a man with a farmer's face and a dry country wit, who had risen the long way through hard service, and when the throne came to him he took it, and held it with the calm competence of a man who has fixed a great many broken things in his life, and is not much impressed by any of them. He and the family he founded we call the Flavians, and they gave Rome, among much else, the single building that the whole world still pictures when it hears the city's name. On the low ground where Nero had once kept a private ornamental lake for his own pleasure, Vespasian chose to build something for everyone, a vast oval house of stone for the games and the crowds, ring upon ring of arches climbing into the sky, with room inside for tens of thousands of Romans to sit together in the sun. He did not live to see it finished. His son Titus opened it after him, in the year we count as 80, with 100 days of games and spectacle. We call it the Colosseum, and much of it still stands today, tawny and enormous and full of light, in the middle of the living modern city, the same arches, the same warm travertine stone, curving up against the same blue Roman sky. And it was in the reign of that same gentle, capable Titus, in the year we count as 79, only a little before the great arena opened, that the mountain spoke. In the soft bright country south of Rome, along the curve of a beautiful bay, there stood a mountain called Vesuvius, green and vineyard-covered and long asleep, and beneath it lay comfortable little towns full of ordinary people going about an ordinary day, and one of those towns was called Pompeii. And on one late summer day the mountain woke, and breathed out a great slow column of ash and stone into the sky, and it came down over the towns and the fields and the roads, soft and grey and endless, hour upon hour, until the whole ordinary day was buried, tables still set, bread still in the ovens, everything covered and sealed and put to sleep beneath the ash. It was, for those towns, a sorrow, and we should not pretend otherwise. But there is a strange gentleness in what the ash did across the long centuries that followed, for it kept that single ordinary day safe and whole in the dark, the way nothing else could have kept it, and handed it down to us at last, across nearly 2,000 years, so that we can walk today down those very streets and see the wheel ruts in the stone and the painted walls and the loaves of bread, and know, better than from any book, exactly how a Roman morning looked and smelled and sounded. A whole day of the world put to sleep under a soft grey blanket and saved. And it is worth pausing here, in the warm middle of the empire, to walk for a little while through that ordinary day, through the daily life of the city itself, which is a most soothing thing to picture as the eyes grow heavy. Picture the great city at its height, 1 million souls and more, the largest gathering of people the Western world had ever seen and would not see again for well over 1,000 years. Picture the poorer folk in the tall crowded apartment blocks they called the insulae, the islands, rising several floors above the noisy streets, a whole city of small rented rooms, and the rich in their low wide houses, the domus, built quietly around cool inner courtyards, where a little fountain played and the light fell soft through an open square in the roof. Picture the forum in the low heart of the city, the old drained marsh now paved in marble, where men in white woolen togas moved slowly among the temples and the law courts and the money changers, and the business of the world was done at the pace of a warm afternoon. Picture the great public baths, vast and vaulted and warm, where a Roman of any rank could go in the afternoon and pass unhurried from the hot room to the warm room to the cool plunge, and be scraped and oiled and rubbed, and lie and talk and doze for the price of the smallest coin, so that even the poorest citizen could feel, for an hour, like a lord. Picture the endless carts of grain coming up from the port, and the free bread given out to the people, and the great games given to fill their days, so that the poets grumbled that the Roman people, who had once ruled themselves, now asked for only 2 things, bread and the games of the arena, bread and circuses, and were content. And picture, in every single one of those homes, from the grandest marble house to the smallest rented room, tucked into a corner or a niche by the door, a little household shrine, the Lararium, where each family kept its own small guardian spirits, the Lares and the Penates, the quiet gods of the hearth and the store cupboard and the doorway, and where each morning someone would pause and offer a little wine or a little bread or a few grains of incense, and murmur a few words to the small gods who watched over that one house and no other. For all its marble and its 1,000,000 people, Rome was, at its heart, a city of 1,000,000 small doorway shrines, 1,000,000 little lamps, each family tending its own quiet light. And listen, in the picture, for the water. For everywhere under the noise of the great city there was the sound of running water, cool and constant, brought in from the distant hills across those long arched aqueducts, mile upon mile of arches striding over the plain, letting the water fall, gently and always downhill, all the way into the city, where it ran singing into the public fountains at every corner and filled the baths and washed the streets, and never, day or night, stopped. A city that could bring itself cool mountain water from 50 miles away and give it free to the poorest at the corner fountain had solved something that most of the world would not solve again for many long centuries. And it did it so quietly, so much as a matter of course, that the water simply became part of the sound of the place, like breathing. Now over these good years the throne passed on from the Flavians, and here the story reaches its calmest and its kindest stretch, a run of rulers that a later age, looking back with a sigh, would call the 5 good emperors, and it is a lovely thing that for once history and the pleasant word agree. For the better part of 100 years, the empire was governed by a string of able, careful, decent men, one after another, and the reason it worked so well is itself gently pleasing. None of these emperors had a son of his own to follow him. And so, instead of handing the vast empire to whatever child chance had given them, each of them looked about among the best grown men he knew, and chose the one who seemed wisest and worthiest, and adopted him as a son and a successor, so that the greatest inheritance in the world passed, for 4 generations, not by blood but by merit, from good man to chosen good man. There was Nerva, elderly and mild, who began the fashion. There was Trajan, whom he chose, a strong and generous soldier emperor from Spain, under whom the empire spread out to its very greatest size. Reaching in the year we count as 117 from the Atlantic in the west to the rivers of the Far East, from the northern moors to the southern sands, the largest that Rome would ever be. So that on the map of that single year the Roman peace lay across the whole warm middle of the world like a hand laid flat upon a table. There was Hadrian, who came next, a restless, curious, clever man who did a wise and unusual thing, for instead of pushing the borders ever outward he chose to stop, and to hold and to make firm what Rome already had. He travelled the whole enormous empire on his own feet, from end to end, looking at everything, and in the far cold north of Britain he drew a line across the narrow neck of the island and built along it a great wall of stone from sea to sea, a wall that still runs today over the green and windy hills of the north, and much of it still stands, low and grey and patient in the rain, marking for all time the quiet northern edge of the Roman world. And in Rome itself Hadrian rebuilt a temple to all the gods, the Pantheon, and raised over it a vast round dome of concrete, open at its very centre to the sky, so that a single round shaft of sunlight moves slowly across the inside of the dome through the whole of the day like the hand of a great clock. And that building too still stands, whole and unbroken, after nearly 2,000 years, its great dome still the work of Roman hands, still open to the same moving light. There was Antoninus Pius after him, so mild and so just and so untroubled that the historians, who love a disaster, can find almost nothing to say of his long reign, except that it was peaceful and happy, which is the very highest praise a quiet mind can imagine, and the very despair of anyone hoping for a good story. And there was, at the last of them, Marcus Aurelius, and he is the one to fall asleep thinking of, for of all the rulers of Rome he is perhaps the gentlest to the mind. He was a philosopher, a man who had wanted, more than anything, a quiet life of study and thought, and who was instead handed the whole heavy weight of the world and asked to carry it, and who carried it, faithfully and without complaint, for close to 20 years. Much of his reign was spent far from Rome, up on the cold northern frontiers, in the mud and the fog of the army camps, holding back the pressure of the peoples beyond the rivers, for the long peace was, by his day, beginning very quietly to strain at its far edges. And there at night, alone in his tent by the light of one small lamp, with the sleeping army all around him and the cold river not far off, this most powerful man in all the world would take up his pen and write, not orders, not laws, not proclamations, but small private notes to himself, gentle reminders to be patient, and kind, and calm, to do his duty without expecting thanks, to remember that all things pass, and that the wise mind meets each day with quietness. He never meant anyone else to read them. He was only steadying his own heart in the dark, the way any of us might. But they were kept, and copied, and handed down, and we have them still, and we call them his meditations, and they remain, after all these centuries, one of the kindest and most consoling books ever written. The night thoughts of a tired good man trying to be better, set down by lamplight while the world slept, and it is a fitting place for our long warm afternoon to reach its close. For when Marcus Aurelius died, up in the north, in the year we count as 180 after the turning of the years, something in the story turned with him, so quietly that no one living felt it move. He was the last of the good chosen ones, the last to hand the empire onward by wisdom rather than by blood, for he had, unlike the four before him, a living son of his own, and to that son, when the time came, he left the world. The long peace was not over, not yet, and the marble still shone, and the water still sang in the fountains, and the roads still ran to every horizon, and the lamps still burned in a million doorways from Britain to the sands. But this was the high tide of it all, the very top of the long slow rising, the fullest and calmest and most golden that Rome would ever be. and a tide, once it has reached its very highest mark upon the shore, and hung there a moment, still and shining, must, by the oldest law there is, begin, very slowly, and at first without a sound, to turn. That turning belongs to another night, for now it is enough to know that the water stood for one long quiet moment at the full, and that somewhere in a cold tent on a far frontier one small lamp burned steadily on, and that far to the south, by the old river where the whole tale began, another small lamp burned on too, in a doorway above the Tiber, patient and warm and unhurried, just as it had on the very first night of all. And so we come to the long, slow dusk of the story, which is not a sad thing at all, only a change in the light. When we left the world a moment ago, the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius had just laid down his pen and closed his eyes for the last time in the year 180, in a soldier's tent somewhere on the cold northern frontier, with the campfires low and the great empire spread out around him from the mists of Britain to the warm sands of Egypt. He had spent his nights writing calm, private thoughts to himself about patience and duty and the smallness of our worries against the great turning of things, and he had ruled well and wearily and to the end. The Roman peace, that long warm afternoon of the world, is said by those who count such things to end on the day he died. But nothing ends all at once. The sun does not set the instant it touches the hills. It only begins very gently to lower, and the light grows long and golden and then blue, and the shadows stretch out soft across the stones, and you can watch the whole thing happen and never once see the exact moment when day becomes evening. That is how Rome changes now, not with a crash, with a lengthening of the light. So let us walk into that evening slowly, the way you walk home when there is no hurry, and let the great city carry us gently down toward the dark. Marcus Aurelius, who was so careful about almost everything, made one very human mistake, and it was the oldest mistake in the world. He loved his son. For most of the long peace, the throne had passed not by blood, but by choosing, each good emperor looking about him for the finest younger man he could find, and adopting him as a son and heir, so that the rule went to ability rather than to accident of birth. Nerva chose Trajan, Trajan chose Hadrian, and so the wisdom went down the line like a lamp passed carefully from hand to hand. But Marcus Aurelius had a living son of his own body, a young man named Commodus, and to him the rule passed by simple nature, as a farm passes to a farmer's boy. And Commodus, it must be said gently, was not his father. Where the father had been thoughtful, the son was vain. Where the father had worn the purple like a heavy duty, the son wore it like a costume. He grew fond of the games, and fonder still of appearing in them himself, coming down into the great arena to fight as though he were one of the hired gladiators, which the dignified old families found faintly horrifying, and which the crowds rather enjoyed, in the way crowds do. He came in time to imagine himself a living god, a new Hercules, and had himself shown that way in stone and coin. And declaring yourself a god, as we have noticed once or twice already in this long story, is a claim that tends to age rather poorly. He was in the end quietly removed by those closest to him, one evening, in the way such things were arranged, and the world exhaled and looked about for what should come next. And here the light truly begins to lengthen, for what came next was a long stretch of years that later historians, tidying it all up from a comfortable distance, would call the troubled 3rd century, though the people living through it simply called it their lives, and rose each morning and baked their bread, and mended their nets, and did not know they were living in a chapter with a worrying name. It was a time of many emperors and short reigns, where once a single steady hand had held the rule for decades. Now the great weight of it passed quickly from man to man, general to general, one after another, some ruling only a year, some only a few months, a few only a matter of weeks before the load proved too much, or the frontier called, or the armies changed their minds. It is a stretch of names that even the most patient students find slippery to hold, and you need not hold them at all. Let them slide past like the names of villages seen from a boat, there and then gently gone. There is a strange comfort in this, if you let there be, all those men in their purple, each so certain in his own morning that he was the one who would set the whole world right at last, each so sure that his name would ring down the ages, and now they lie together in the same soft blur of the history books, remembered only as a list, a rushing procession of the briefly mighty. Gone by so fast that the ink scarcely has time to name them before the next one comes. It is the sort of thing the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius himself had written about on his cold quiet nights, that all the striving and the glory pass like smoke, that emperor and slave alike come at last to the same still ground, and here, in the very century after his own. The world set about proving his gentle point over and over, throne after throne, as if the whole age were a lesson in the smallness of ambition, written large across 50 short reigns. What matters, told softly, is only this. The great house of Rome had grown so vast that no single pair of hands could easily hold every door of it at once. The frontiers were very long. In the north, along the grey rivers, the peoples of the forests pressed gently but steadily against the boundary stones, not out of hatred, but out of hunger and movement, and the simple pressure of one people leaning upon another far away, the way a crowd sways when those at the back push forward without malice. In the east, across the deserts, a great and ancient rival kingdom stirred and tested the edges. And so the emperors of these years spent their reigns forever hurrying from one frontier to another, from the cold rivers to the hot sands and back, mending the fences of the world, and the mending wore them out. The coinage tells the quiet story better than any battle. The old Roman silver, once bright and heavy and honest, grew slowly thinner and paler as the years went by. A little less silver in each coin, and then a little less again, until the shining pieces that had once bought a soldier's loyalty and a merchant's grain became grey and light and worth less than they said they were. Prices drifted upward the way water rises in a cellar, slowly and without drama, and a coin no longer bought what it once had. This is not the sort of thing that makes for a stirring tale, and no poet ever sang of the debasement of the silver, but it is the truest kind of trouble, the slow, quiet, arithmetic kind that hollows a thing out from the inside while its walls still stand tall and proud in the sun. And yet, and this is the gentle heart of it, the roads still ran. The great stone roads that Rome had laid down over the centuries, straight and patient across mountain and marsh, still carried their carts and their travellers from town to town, and the milestones still counted off the miles to the city. The aqueducts still sang their thin cool ribbons of water down out of the hills and into the fountains of 100 towns, and people still filled their jars at them in the morning as their grandparents had. The baths still steamed, the markets still opened, the little shrine by each household door, the lararium with its small clay figures of the family's own kind spirits, still received its morning crumb and its whispered good morning. And in a doorway somewhere by the slow-brown Tiber, a single small oil lamp still burned through the night as it always had. A little flame in a cup of clay, tended by someone whose name we will never know, who had no idea that the century they lived in would one day be called troubled, and who only knew that the oil was low and the night was long and the flame was company. The great things wobble, and the small things go on. That is nearly always the way of it. A woman in a hill town in the west rose before dawn and set her dough to rise and swept her doorstep, and the price of her flour had crept up a little since her mother's day, and the young men of the town were away more often now on the frontiers, and now and then a coin she was handed rang a little dull and grey where once it would have rung bright. But the sun still came up warm over the tiled roofs, and the fountain in the square still ran cool and clear from the far green hills, and her bread still rose, and the smell of it still filled the lane the way it had filled the lanes of Rome for 1,000 mornings. Empires are held up, in the end, not by their emperors, but by 10,000 such quiet dawns, each one carrying the world forward another single day without ever knowing it is doing anything at all. And through this whole long uneasy century those quiet dawns kept coming, one after another, faithfully the way they always do. Into this long, uneasy dusk, at last there came a steadying hand, and his name was Diocletian. He rose the way many rose in those years, up through the hard ranks of the army, a soldier's soldier from a plain family in the rough country across the sea to the east, a practical man with a practical mind, and no illusions at all about how difficult his job was going to be. And Diocletian looked at the enormous, sprawling, half-unmanageable empire he had been handed, a thing the size of the whole known world, with frontiers a man could not ride the length of in a year, and he did the wisest and least glamorous thing a person can do with a burden too heavy to lift alone. He did not pretend he could lift it, he shared it. He took a trusted fellow soldier and raised him up to rule beside him as a second emperor, so that one of them could mind the eastern half of the world, while the other minded the western half, the two of them working the great estate like two brothers working one enormous farm from opposite ends. And then, because even a half was still a very great deal, each of the two chief rulers took a younger partner beneath him, a deputy and heir in waiting, so that in the end there were 4 rulers in all, sharing the load in a careful arrangement that later ages would call the tetrarchy, which is only an old word meaning the rule of 4. 4 pairs of hands upon the one great weight. It was not tidy, and it did not always run smoothly, for 4 proud men are 4 proud men, but it worked, for a time, and it steadied the reeling house, and it bought the empire a long, quiet breath it very badly needed. Diocletian did more than divide the rule. He was a great orderer of things, a man who loved a list and a clear line, and he went through the sprawling provinces and reorganized them into smaller, neater pieces that could each be watched and taxed and governed with less confusion. He fixed the army's arrangements and tried, with mixed success, to fix the drifting prices by simple decree, publishing a great long list of what everything ought to cost, from a measure of wheat to a day of a carpenter's labour, which is the sort of thing that reads beautifully on a stone wall, and works rather less beautifully in a busy marketplace, for prices, like cats, do not much care what you have decreed, but the effort itself tells you the kind of man he was, one who believed the great machine could be repaired if only someone patient enough sat down and repaired it, bolt by bolt. And then Diocletian did the most remarkable thing of all, the thing almost no man who has ever held such power has been willing to do. He stopped. He grew old and tired and unwell, and rather than clutch the purple to the last breath as nearly every ruler before him had done, he simply laid it down of his own free will and walked away. He retired, an emperor retiring as a farmer or a shopkeeper retires, and went home to a great sprawling palace he had built for himself on the quiet coast of his native land by the sea, and there he spent his last years, by every fond old story, tending his garden and growing his vegetables. It is said that when the world grew tangled again after he left, and men came to beg him to return and take up the rule once more and set it all right, he told them, with the serene stubbornness of a man who has found something better, that if they could only see the cabbages he had planted with his own hands, they would never dream of asking him to trade such peace for the burden of the world again. Whether he truly said it or not, the world has kept the story, because the world dearly loves the picture of it. The master of the whole earth, who once moved armies with a nod, kneeling happily in the dirt among his cabbages, wanting nothing more. Of all the ways to leave a throne, it is surely the gentlest, and it belongs in a story told for sleep. Imagine him there in the long evenings of his last years, an old man in plain clothes on the quiet coast, the great palace behind him, and the calm sea before him, walking the rows of his garden as the light went gold and then blue over the water, checking his beans and his cabbages and his little fruit trees, untroubled at last by frontiers and coinage and the endless quarrels of proud men. He had held the whole turning world in his 2 hands, and had felt its full crushing weight, and he had discovered, as very few of the mighty ever allow themselves to discover, that a row of well-tended vegetables in the evening light can be worth more to a tired heart than all the purple in the world. It is a good thought to rest on, that even the very greatest burden can, in the end, be set gently down, But an arrangement of 4 proud rulers, however clever, holds together only so long as the men in it are willing, and after Diocletian went to his cabbages, the careful balance he had built began to lean and shift, the 4 partners and their sons and their armies each leaning a little toward their own advantage, until out of that long, quiet, jostling one figure rose slowly and steadily above all the rest, and his name has come down to us as Constantine, called the Great. He was the son of one of the 4 rulers, raised in the hard school of camps and frontiers, and he was patient, and he was watchful, and he was very, very good at the long game. Piece by piece, year by year, he gathered the divided rule back into his own single pair of hands, until the 4 had become one again, and the whole vast empire, east and west together, answered once more to a single voice. And Constantine did 2 things that between them turned the whole course of the world, so quietly and over so many years that no one living through them could have seen the size of what was happening. The first was a matter of the spirit. All through these long centuries there had been growing, gently and mostly out of sight, a new faith, the faith of the Christians, followers of a teacher from the eastern province of Judea, a faith that had begun very small among fishermen and workers and the poor, and had spread quietly along those same Roman roads and Roman sea lanes, carried in the hearts of ordinary travellers from town to town and house to house. For a long time it had been a faith lived carefully, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes under suspicion. Its people meeting in modest rooms and remembered mostly for their stubborn refusal to burn a pinch of incense to the emperor's image, for how, after all, could a person who worshipped one god bow to a man who called himself divine? And now Constantine, for reasons the historians have argued over ever since, and which we need not untangle tonight, turned toward that faith. He came to believe, by his own account, that the Christian God had helped him to his victories, and he threw the whole enormous weight of the empire's favour behind the once-hidden faith. Together with his fellow ruler in the east, he set his name to a great decision, remembered as the edict issued from the northern city of Milan that declared, simply and mercifully, that the Christians and indeed all people might now worship as they chose, in peace, without fear, their meeting places restored and their long unease lifted. It does not sound, said so plainly, like a thing to shake the earth. But it was. For with that single quiet act the small hidden faith of the fisherman stepped out of the shadowed rooms and into the sunlight of the greatest power on earth, and from that morning it began its long steady climb from the faith of the few to the faith of the many, and in time the faith of the emperors themselves, the smallest of seeds grown, over patient generations, into the tree that would shelter the whole coming age. It is one of the quietest turning points in all of history, and it turned in a room, with ink, and not on any battlefield. And from that morning the new faith, spread not by the sword, but by the ordinary traffic of a settled world, carried by merchants along the coast roads, by soldiers from post to post, by servants and wives and travellers, told over shared bread, and passed from neighbour to neighbour the way all the best and quietest things travel. Little churches began to rise in the towns, plain at first and then grander, and where once the great temples of the old gods had stood at the heart of every forum, now a new kind of building began to gather the people in. The old gods did not vanish overnight, of course. 1,000 years of household shrines and harvest festivals and small familiar rites do not simply blow away in a season, and out in the deep countryside, among the fields and the woods, the old ways lingered on for generations, gentle and stubborn as moss on a wall. But the tide had turned, and everyone who watched the water could feel which way it was now flowing. The faith that had begun among a handful of fishermen by a far eastern lake had become, within the span of a few long lifetimes, the faith toward which the whole vast empire was quietly leaning. The second thing Constantine did was a matter of place, and it was every bit as great. He looked, as Diocletian had looked, at the vast empire, and he saw where its weight and its wealth truly lay, and they lay, more and more, in the rich and ancient and populous East, the lands of old cities and old trade and warm harbours, and not in the tired and thinning West. And so Constantine made a decision as bold as any in the story. He would build a new capital. A second Rome. Out in the east, upon a superb spit of land, where the waters of Europe and Asia very nearly touch, on the shore of a narrow strait called the Bosphorus, at a small old Greek town called Byzantium, blessed with deep safe harbours and defended on almost every side by water. There he raised a great new city, with new walls and new forums and new churches and a new senate, pouring into it the wealth and art and energy of the world, and he named it, with the plain confidence of a founder, after himself, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And with the building of that shining new city in the east, the very centre of gravity of the whole Roman world, which had rested for 1,000 years upon the 7 hills above the Tiber, began its long, slow, irreversible slide eastward, like a great ship shifting its ballast, riding lower now in the eastern waters and higher, lighter, emptier in the old western ones. Rome, the old mother city on the Tiber, was still honoured, still vast, still crowded with her temples and her arches and her memories, but she was no longer quite the heart. The heart was moving to the water's edge in the east, to the young city that bore Constantine's name. And so, as our chapter draws on toward its own gentle evening, picture the whole enormous empire now as a single very old and very grand house that has simply grown too large for any one family to keep warm in every room. In the east, around the new city on the Bosphorus, the lamps burn bright and many, the markets are full, the harbours crowded with sails, the churches rising, the coins still reasonably honest, the whole eastern half humming with wealth and people and confidence, looking forward. And in the west, around the old city on the Tiber, the rooms have grown quieter and cooler. The great buildings still stand, more beautiful than ever in the long light, but there are fewer hands to tend them, the frontiers press harder and the taxes come in thinner, and a certain hush has settled over the western halls, not yet an ending, only a stillness, like a grand old wing of a house where the family no longer often goes. 2 halves of one roof, warm and cool, bright and dim, leaning very gently apart. For a good while yet, single strong rulers still now and then gathered the whole of it back under one hand, as Constantine had, and the last man ever to do so, to hold the entire Roman world, east and west together, in a single grasp, was an emperor named Theodosius, who ruled firmly and devoutly near the close of this long century, a Christian emperor now through and through, under whom the once hidden faith became at last the settled and official faith of the whole empire, the temples of the old gods falling quiet and the churches filling. Theodosius held the great house together to the end of his own life by sheer weight of will. But he was, as all men are, mortal, and when he came to die, in the year 395, he did the most natural and most fateful thing a father with an empire can do. He had 2 sons, and he loved them both, and rather than choose between them, he divided the world between them, giving the rich and hopeful east to the one, and the tired and beautiful west to the other, so that each boy might have a throne of his own. He surely meant it as most fathers mean such things, as fairness, as love, as a tidy sharing out of the family estate. He can hardly have meant it as an ending. But that quiet, kindly, fatherly act of division in the year 395 was the line after which the 2 halves never truly came together again. From that day the east and the west were 2 separate houses under one long sagging roof, no longer one Roman world with 2 capitals, but 2 Roman worlds, drifting slowly, gently, and forever apart, each with its own emperor, its own court, its own fate waiting for it up ahead in the dark. And so we come to rest at the close of this long dusk, with the light very low and golden now across the whole Roman world. In the east, the new city on the Bosphorus glitters with wealth and faith and confidence, its walls high, its future long. And its future would indeed be long, for that eastern half of the story had many bright centuries still ahead of it, though that is a tale for other nights than this. And in the west, the old rooms grow quiet. The great mother city on the 7 hills, where our whole story began so many nights ago with a few shepherds' huts and a single lamp above a marshy river, still stands in the long evening light, her temples and her forums and her arches all in their places, her memory as vast as ever, but the warmth has drawn eastward, and a soft and patient hush has settled over her old streets, the hush of a very great day drawing at last toward its rest. And there, in a doorway by the slow brown Tiber, where it has burned through every chapter of this long story, through the kings and the republic, through Hannibal and Caesar, through the golden peace and the troubled century and the coming of the new faith, that single small oil lamp is burning still, low and steady and warm in its little cup of clay, tended by hands whose names the great history books will never trouble to write down, casting its small gold circle of light out onto the old worn stones. The empire has grown vast beyond imagining, and then divided itself gently in two. Emperors have risen and fought and worn themselves out, and gone home to their cabbages. A hidden faith has climbed quietly up into the daylight, and a new city has risen in the east to take the old one's place. But the lamp by the Tiber knows nothing of all that. It only burns, patient and small, as it always has, keeping its little watch over the water and the dark, and it is burning still, low and gold and gentle, as the long western evening deepens softly toward the last quiet chapter of all. And so we come to the last of the road, the gentlest stretch of all, where the light lengthens and softens and the great long day of Rome slides down at last toward its quiet evening. We left the world divided in the year 395, when Theodosius, the last man to rule the whole of it, closed his eyes for the final time and left the enormous house to his two sons, the east to one and the west to the other, and the empire that had once been a single roof over the whole warm sea became two roofs, leaning gently against one another, sharing a wall. The east, around the new city on the Bosphorus, was bright and rich and full, its granaries deep, its walls high, its harbours crowded with grain ships and lamplight. The west, around the old city on the Tiber, was quieter now, and thinner, like a fire that has burned all evening and settled down to embers that still glow, that still give warmth, but that no longer leap and crackle the way they did at the height of the night. Keep that picture with you as we go, because everything that follows is not a crash and not a catastrophe, whatever the old dramatic histories might tell you. It is a long, slow, tender evening, in which one small lamp is at last, very softly, set down upon a table, while its light goes on burning in 1,000 other windows. Let us walk it slowly. There is no hurry here. There was never any hurry. Let your breathing go long and even, and let the years drift past you like mist, coming off a slow river at the end of a warm day. Begin with the peoples of the north and of the wide grasslands, the great open country that rolls away east and north beyond every frontier Rome had ever drawn. For a very long time these peoples had lived along the far edges of the empire, trading across the rivers, serving in the legions, farming the borderlands, growing up in the long shadow of Rome and, in their own quiet way, growing half Roman while they did it. The Goths and the Vandals and the many others whose names drift through this last chapter were not strangers appearing out of the dark. Most of them had known Rome all their lives. They wore Roman cloth. They carried Roman coins in their belts. They spoke Roman words, softened and bent into their own mouths. Many of them had fought for Rome for years, in Roman armour, under Roman standards, and had come to think of themselves, not unreasonably, as belonging to the world of Rome as much as anyone born inside the walls. And now, gently pressed one against another, moved by pressures far out on the grasslands that we can only half see from here, by hunger and by weather and by other peoples pushing behind them, they began to drift inward, in ones and twos, and then in whole slow-moving households, wagons and cattle and children and grandmothers, drifting into the thinning western provinces the way water finds the low places in a field. Not with a roar, but with a patience that is almost tender to imagine. The Western Empire, for its part, did not so much fight this as absorb it, in the old Roman way, the way it had always absorbed the Sabines and the Etruscans and the Greeks and everyone else it had ever met. It made bargains. It gave land. It gave titles and pay and grand Latin ranks to the leaders of these wandering peoples, and asked them in return to hold the frontier and to keep the peace, so that whole regions of the West came, quietly and without much ceremony, to be farmed and guarded and governed by people the old writers still called barbarians, but who dressed and spoke and worshipped very much as their Roman neighbours did. And you must picture it very gently, this changing over, because it did not happen in a day or in a year, but across whole slow lifetimes, the way a wood changes its trees, one falling softly in a storm and another rising unnoticed in its place, until without any single moment you could point to, the wood is a different wood, and yet the same wood still. A farmer in the hills of Gaul might have been born under one order and grown old under another, and never once felt the ground shift beneath his feet, only noticed, perhaps, that the tax collector spoke with a different accent now, and that the soldiers who kept the road safe wore their hair a little differently, and that the harvest came in much as it always had, and the seasons turned much as they always had, and the small lamp still burned in the doorway at the end of the day much as it always had. It is one of the softest ironies of this whole long story that the empire did not fall to strangers battering at a locked gate. It changed hands, slowly and mostly gently, among people who had all grown up inside the same wide, warm world, until one could hardly say any longer where Rome ended and the newcomers began. The line between the two simply faded, the way the line between the land and the water fades in the mist at the bottom of the hills. And then, in the year 410, there came a moment that the whole world paused to notice, a moment that the poets of the age wept over in their letters, though it was, when you look at it closely, more sorrow than horror. Alaric, a leader of the Visigoths, a man who had himself served Rome and asked Rome, again and again, only for land and for pay and for a settled place for his people, and who had been refused and put off with fair words, at last brought his people to the old city on the 7 hills. And on a soft night in late summer, a gate was quietly opened, and the Visigoths came into Rome. For 3 days they moved through the streets, taking what could be carried, sparing the great churches, where many of them, being Christians themselves, went to pray, and then they left again and drifted southward, looking, as they had always been looking, for somewhere to settle. It was the first time in 800 years, since the far-off day when the Gauls had come, that any enemy had entered the city of Rome. 800 years. Think of that gently as you lie there. For 8 centuries the city had stood unentered, so long that no living person could remember otherwise, so long that it had become simply a fact of the world, like the sun rising, like the Tiber running to the sea, and now in a single quiet season the unshakable city had been shaken, and the whole world, east and west, sat up in the lamplight and understood, in a way it had not quite understood before, that even Rome was a thing that could end. The old writers who lived through it did not describe fire and terror so much as a kind of vast, hushed astonishment, the astonishment of a child who learns for the first time that a grandparent can grow old. But the world did not end in 410, and this is one of the quiet lessons of this last chapter, that endings are almost never as sudden as they look from far away. Rome went on. The sun came up over the 7 hills the next morning, and the bread was baked, and the fountains still ran where the aqueducts still reached them, and children were still born and named and carried to the little shrine by the door where the household gods, the Lares and the Penates, kept their small patient watch as they had kept it for 1,000 years. Life is very stubborn. It does not know that it is supposed to have stopped, and so for another lifetime the story simply carried on, softer and thinner each year, like a song being hummed lower and lower as the singer grows sleepy, but never quite falling silent. Other peoples came and passed like weather. Attila and the Huns rode in out of the east, out of the great grasslands, a name that frightened the whole world for a handful of years, and they pressed hard against both halves of the empire, and then, as weather does, they passed on and passed away. And Attila himself died quietly in his bed one night, and his great following scattered like clouds after a storm, and the sky was clear again, if paler than before. The Huns were a fright, and a rumour, and then a memory, all within the space of a few short years, and the old city on the Tiber outlasted them as it had outlasted so much, sitting on its hills, growing quieter, watching the centuries go by. It is a small comfort, and a true one, to remember how many terrors the old city had already outlived by then. It had outlived the Gauls in the far-off youth of the Republic. It had outlived Hannibal and his elephants when it seemed the whole world might end at the gates. It had outlived 100 years of its own quarrels, and emperors good and bad, and fires and plagues, and the long slow troubles of the 3rd century, and it had gone on. Always gone on. Because a city, it turns out, is a very durable and patient thing, made not only of stone, but of habit, of the simple daily determination of ordinary people to bake the bread and draw the water and light the lamp again tomorrow. And so it went on now, older and thinner and greyer at the edges, like a great tree that has lost some of its high branches to the wind but still stands, still leafs out every spring, still throws its long shade across the ground it has always shaded. Then came the Vandals, from across the sea, from the warm coast of Africa where Carthage had once stood, that same Carthage that Rome had erased so long ago, in the far-off chapter of Hannibal and Scipio and the long wars over the water. There is a soft roundness to that, if you care to notice it, that the descendants of the peoples along that African shore should sail back across the very same sea toward the very same city so many centuries later, when the wheel of the world had turned all the way round. Gaiseric led them, and in the year 455 they came to Rome and entered it a second time, and for a fortnight they gathered up the treasures of the old city and carried them down to their ships and sailed away again. It was, once more sorrow than fury. The city was not burned to the ground. It was simply, gently, emptied a little further, the way a great house is emptied room by room when a family has grown small and no longer needs so many rooms, the furniture carried out quietly, the shutters closed one by one, the echoes growing longer in the halls. And through all this the Western throne itself grew smaller and smaller, until it was almost a tender thing, almost a thing to smile at with real fondness rather than to mourn. The emperors of the West in these last years ruled little more than Italy, and sometimes hardly even that, boys and mild men raised up and set down by the real powers of the day, the great commanders of the mixed Roman and northern armies who did the actual governing and let the emperors wear the purple and hold the old titles. The grand words went on being spoken. The Senate still met in the Forum, that same Forum drained from the marsh 1,000 years before, and still voted itself dignities and honours, still wrapped itself in the language of the Senate and the people of Rome, of the letters that had marched on the standards to the ends of the earth, even as the actual reach of Rome shrank down and down to the space you could see from the top of the Capitoline Hill. There is the old dry truth of this whole long story, gently repeated one final time, that the grander the words grew, the smaller the power beneath them, the Senate voting itself ever more solemn honours precisely as the world it once ruled slipped, quiet as sand, out between its fingers. And so we reach the very last of it, the small soft moment that the history books, fond of a tidy date, have chosen to call the fall of the Western Roman Empire, though the people alive at the time scarcely noticed it happen at all. In the year 476, the throne of the West was held by a boy, a child raised to the purple by his father, a general, more as a gesture than as a true reign. And the boy's name, by one of those small strange gifts that history sometimes leaves lying on the path for us to find, was Romulus. Romulus Augustulus, they called him, Little Augustus, Little Romulus, a name that carried in itself, all unknowing, the whole 1,000 years of the story, for you will remember, from the very first chapter of this long night, that the man who founded the city upon the Palatine, who drew the first furrow and gave Rome its name, was also called Romulus. Rome's first king and Rome's last Western emperor bore the very same name. A story that began with a Romulus ended with a Romulus, and no one planned it, and no one arranged it. And yet there it is, the two names bracketing 1,000 years like the two lamps at either end of a long dark hall. History does not usually rhyme so neatly. When it does, it seems only right to pause a moment in the lamplight and be quietly grateful for it. And how did it end, this line of Romulus, this thing that had begun with a she-wolf and a furrow and a handful of huts on a green hill above a slow river? It ended the way a tired household ends its evening. A commander named Odoacer, a leader of the mixed northern soldiers who by now made up the armies of Italy, a man who had served Rome all his life and thought of himself, in his own way as a Roman, simply set the boy aside. He did not kill him. He did not need to. He sent young Romulus off to live out his days in comfort in a pleasant villa on the coast of the Bay of Naples, in the soft country near where Vesuvius still smoked gently over the buried town of Pompeii, and there the last Western emperor lived on, a boy growing quietly into a man with a garden and a view of the sea, while the world forgot to give him a successor. For that is the whole of it. Odoacer did not seize the throne. He simply did not trouble to name a new emperor for the West at all. He sent the imperial robes and the ornaments away east to Constantinople, to the emperor there, with a gentle message that the West no longer had need of its own, and he ruled Italy himself, in his own name, as a king. And so the Western line ended, not with a crash, and not with a scream, not with fire on the Capitol or the sky falling in, but with a general who simply chose not to fill an empty chair, and a door in an old house closing softly on its hinges, and no one, that night, hearing it close. Let that be the true shape of the fall then, as you lie there with your eyes growing heavy. Not a wall breached, not a city burned, but a lamp set down. Somewhere in the old city on the Tiber, in the year 476, in a doorway of a house that had stood for many generations, an ordinary person, tired at the end of an ordinary day, reached up and turned down a small oil lamp, the same kind of small clay lamp that had burned in the doorway of that first hut on the Palatine so many centuries before, at the very start of our story. And the little flame guttered and shrank and folded itself down into a thread of gold, and then into a curl of grey smoke rising in the dark, and the person went to their bed and slept, not knowing and not needing to know that anything at all had ended, because in truth almost nothing had. The bread would still be baked in the morning, the Tiber would still run to the sea, the stones would still hold their warmth from the day, for here is the great soft secret of this last chapter, the thing worth carrying down with you into sleep. Rome did not truly end. It never really ended at all. It only changed the way that daylight changes into dusk, and dusk into a night so full of stars that you cannot say the light has gone, only that it has been shared out among 1,000 smaller fires. Think first of the east, of that bright rich half of the empire around Constantinople, which did not fall in the year 476 or anywhere near it. The Eastern Romans, who never once stopped calling themselves Romans, went on ruling from their great city on the Bosphorus for nearly another 1,000 years, through empire and gold and mosaic and law, a whole second life of Rome as long again as the first, so that when the old city on the Tiber had grown quiet and grass-grown, there was still a Roman emperor on a throne in the east, still a Roman court, still Roman law being written down in Latin and then in Greek, carried on and on across the centuries until a time so much nearer to our own it would surprise you. Rome, the idea of Rome, the name and the law and the purple, simply picked itself up and walked eastward, and lived another long full life by another shore. And this is worth resting on a moment, gently, before we let it go, because it is so easily forgotten. When the old histories speak of the fall of Rome in the year 476, they mean only the western half, only the throne on the Tiber. Away to the east in that same year, in the great city on the Bosphorus, an emperor sat on a Roman throne, and the courts sat, and the law was pleaded, and the coins were struck, and the churches shone with gold, and no one there thought for a moment that Rome had fallen, because for them it plainly had not. They would have been puzzled, even a little amused to hear it said. Their empire would go on to build its greatest church, to write down the whole vast body of Roman law in one enormous ordered collection that every later age would lean upon, to hold its walls against every comer for 1,000 more years, so that the true measure of Rome is not the little door closing in the west, but the long, bright second evening in the east, half a story again, as long as all the story we have told tonight, still to come after the point where our own tale sets down its lamp. And westward, where the throne had emptied, Rome did not vanish either. It did something quieter, and in its way, more lasting. It soaked into the ground of the world. Walk anywhere across the old western provinces even now, all these long centuries later, and you are walking on Rome. The roads are still there, the great straight patient roads that ran from Britain to the desert, many of them still followed under newer stone, still carrying the traffic of the world along the lines the Roman surveyors drew with their level and their string. The aqueducts still stand, their tall arches striding across valleys in the south of Europe, some of them still carrying water, all of them still teaching every builder who looks at them how an arch holds up the sky. The great round dome of the Pantheon still stands whole and perfect over its own floor, the largest such dome in the world for longer than anyone can quite believe, so that every dome raised since, on every capital and cathedral and hall in the world, is in some quiet way a grandchild of a Roman temple. And beside the roads and the aqueducts and the domes, there is the humbler stuff too, the everyday cleverness of Rome that never left us. The concrete they mixed, that grey patient stuff they poured into their arches and their harbours and their great round vaults, was so good a recipe that the world spent long centuries afterward simply trying to remember how they had done it. The very shape of a town, the straight crossing streets, the central square, the public fountain, the bathhouse, the market laid out just so, is a Roman shape, printed once upon the map of half the world and never quite rubbed out. Look at a town square anywhere across the old western lands, and you are looking, however faintly, at the forum drained from the marsh so long ago, its ghost still ordering the streets, and deeper than the stone, there is the law. So much of the law that governs the Western world. The very idea that there should be written law at all, plain and public and the same for everyone, set up for all to read as the 12 tables were once set up in the Forum, comes down to us from Rome, root and branch, worn smooth by the handling of many centuries, but Roman still at the core. And deeper even than the law, there is the tongue. The Latin that was once only the speech of a few shepherds in a marshy valley in Latium did not die when the Western throne emptied. It went on living in the mouths of ordinary people, softening and changing from town to town and valley to valley, until it had become Italian in Italy and Spanish in Spain and Portuguese along the western coast, and French in Gaul and Romanian far away in the east. 5 daughters of one old mother, and it seeded itself so deeply into the speech of the North as well, that today, when you speak, nearly half the words you use are Latin words worn down by time, so that you cannot describe the fall of Rome without using, in every second breath, the very language of Rome. There is a joke folded up inside that, gentle and enormous, that the empire we call fallen is still doing most of our talking for us, and has been all along, in every language of half the world. And the calendar too, the very shape of the year, the 12 months turning over our nights, still carries Rome inside it, the months that Julius Caesar set in order so long ago, the month of July that keeps his name, and the month of August that keeps the name of the first emperor. So that we cannot even say the date of a thing without 2 long-dead Romans quietly speaking up. Every arch in every bridge, every straight road, every dome, every law court, every word of Latin hidden inside a plain everyday sentence, every month of the turning year, all of it is Rome, not disappeared, not fallen, but come down out of the daylight of history and settled into the ground beneath our feet, become the floor we stand on without ever thinking to look down. That is what the grandeur that was Rome finally became. Not a ruin to be mourned, though there are ruins, beautiful ones, standing golden in the evening light, but the ground itself, the quiet foundation, the thing so deeply woven into the world that we have stopped being able to see it, the way you stop seeing the beams that hold up the roof over your bed. So the lamp that we lit in the very first minute of this long night, the small clay lamp burning in a doorway of a hut on a green hill above a slow river, the lamp that promised that from one small quiet place 1,000-year story would grow to touch the whole world, has kept every part of that promise, and more, and now it has done its work. The story has grown from 7 empty hills to master of the whole warm sea and back down again to a single door quietly closing, and out through that door into the roads and the domes and the law and the language and the very calendar of half the world, so that the light was never put out at all, only handed on and on and on into windows too many to count, one of which, this very night, is yours. Are you still awake? It is all right if you are drifting now. That is exactly as it should be. There is another quiet story waiting for you here on the screen when you are ready for it. Another long calm night to walk through gently, whenever you would like to walk it. And if you have truly enjoyed these 1,000 years we have spent together, if this slow warm walk down the long road of Rome has been a kindness to you at the end of your day, then you might, only if you truly wish to, leave a soft like or subscribe so that the lamp stays lit for the next sleepless traveller who comes looking for a gentle voice in the dark. But there is no hurry, and nothing is asked of you now, nothing at all, except to rest. You have come all the way from the 7 hills to the setting down of the last small lamp, and that is a very long way to have travelled, and you have earned your sleep. So let your shoulders grow heavy, let the last of the day's weight slide off you and sink away into the soft dark. Let your breathing go slow and long, the way the Tiber goes slow and long, as it winds down at last to the sea. The lamp by the river is burning low now, low and gold and warm, its little flame growing smaller and softer, folding itself gently down toward rest, and there is nothing left to do, and nowhere left to go, and no more road to walk tonight. Close your eyes. The great long story is safely told, and the city sleeps on its 7 hills under the same old moon, and the last small lamp by the Tiber burns lower, and goes gently, quietly out. Good night, and sweet dreams.